our first guest, Ernie Dronenberg. He's the county assessor, recorder, and county clerk. He's been pretty busy lately. He's opened up some new offices and had some extended hours added. So things are going pretty well for him, if that's an economic indicator. So we're going to hear from him now.
Thank you and good morning. I want to welcome you to help kick off this 34th annual San Diego Economic Roundtable, and I want to thank accordingly the co-sponsors, and those people are the San Diego Workforce Partnership, the USD School of Business, and the UT San Diego. I used to carry the UT as a young man, so I can relate to UT. It used to be just the Tribune and just the Union, but now in the times it's the UT San Diego. Have brought together these experts this morning, and they're going to amaze and delight you with their forecasts of the future. As the assessor, we do some forecasting, but we're usually doing it mostly from what we just have finished as far as the current year. In our current year, where our real estate market was up 5.6% as you measure taxes. So I'm looking forward to hear what they think the increase is going to be so that I can then tell my budget people we've got a lot more money coming. I look forward to hearing their expertise, and I want to take the opportunity to thank a person I met this morning. I've seen him before, we really haven't met, and that's the Dean of the USD School of Business Administration. He's going to now join, and thank him for being our host in this great facility. I always come here thinking what a beautiful facility this is. And I noticed recently it was ranked one of the most beautiful campuses in the whole United States. So I want to thank him for being our host, and that's Jaime Gomez, Dean of the USD School of Business Administration.
What a glorious day. This is a moment in which we are going to be talking about the future. There are three ways in which we in the School of Business understand the future. One is the future comes to me and captures me. That is alternative number one. I'm going to wait for everybody to have a seat. I'll wait, don't you worry. We have plenty of space. As I was saying, there are three ways to see the future. One is it comes to me and it captures me, it takes me. The second way is I see the future and I adapt to it, Darwin. And number three, we create the future. We want to be co-creators of our new future. At the University of San Diego, this is exactly what we do. And we actually do it via education with purpose. The Tijuana-San Diego area, depending on how we count, is a $220, $230 billion economy. And we want this economy to move to 250, to 60, and become a very sustainable and prosperous society in the top 50 largest economies of the world. There are 4 strategies that we are actually implementing in the School of Business in order to be co-creators of a new prosperous and sustainable society. We work with 25% of the economically active population in the area of San Diego, the military community. And via our master's degrees and our initiatives in entrepreneurship and innovation, we developed together with this highly talented group of people 4 potential avenues when they migrate into civic life. They become consultants, they become executives, entrepreneurs, and coaches and mentors. We have had more than 400 people going through this process so far. That is initiative number 1. We work with our business military community. We also work with our student population. And we really invite them to start their own business and create new employment and new wealth. In fact, last year, 37% of our graduates started their own business. We are really happy about these particular statistics. We also work with our business community. Last year, we had a joint venture with the Small Business Administration, and today, we are actually launching a new small business development center as a way to help entrepreneurs and business owners in the community to enrich and enhance their business operations with an innovation and technology approach. And we also work globally with the business community around the world in order to envision the business enterprise in a much more robust way. In addition to profits, we want to envision the business enterprise being socially inclusive, people, ecologically friendly planet, profitable, and also related to peace and prosperity. We actually want to envision, it's a willful act, we want to envision the business enterprise as a bottom line business approach. In our current society, governments and institutions are working hard on creating more peaceful and prosperous society. We, as a school of business, as a higher education institution, we are and we want to be part of this effort. The 4 strategies I mentioned and shared with all of you, they are just a sample of the many initiatives that we have at university level. We educate socially responsible and internationally competitive leaders who transform lives and communities. Our legacy is education with purpose. Education with purpose that is relevant and responsive to market needs, respectful and inclusive across diverse groups, lifestyles, and political borders. And very important, it has a positive social, economic, financial prosperity and peaceful impact in our communities. This morning, we are really happy. We feel honored to join forces with all of you in creating the future together. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the School of Business. Welcome to the University of San Diego.
Okay, team, good morning. I'm really looking forward to this. I'm Jeff Light, the editor and publisher of the Union Tribune. For those of you who know me, I'm a genuine enthusiast for economics. And I think it's an auspicious day for this gathering. If those of you saw Paul Krugman headlining the Fake News Awards last night, it was interesting to me that the New York Times had this forecast of the probability of the outcomes of the election. And of course, it was famously wrong. They had Clinton at, I think, above 90% on election day. So that was sort of a catastrophic error. And not many hours passed after that Krugman came out and was asked to forecast what the impact of the Trump presidency would be. And he said, the market will never recover. And the Dow was at 18,000 on that day. It's about 26,000 today, so I think it's up 46%. Now, I did go back and look. Ray Major talked about some of these things last year, and his numbers were way better than Krugman's. So put that on your resume. And we also at the UT have a panel of economists as well as CEOs who make forecasts as well. And I think the CEOs did a little bit better this year. Everybody's numbers were pretty good. Slightly pessimistic on almost everything, meaning not terribly, but underestimating the performance on unemployment, interest rates, joblessness, and a little optimistic on GDP, although we don't have the Q4 numbers, so maybe we can't judge that one. At any rate, the news business, much easier than the forecasting business. We get to look backward, or not forward. Great quote by Nassim Taleb, a very interesting economic thinker, that says something along the lines of, the difficulty with forecasting is we're not very good at truly understanding the parameters of whatever system we think is running the world. really something to think about, both in terms of economics, also in terms of news, and as we try to make sense of the world this year. So with that thought, I will leave you and introduce the San Diego's bon vivant of employment, Phil Blair. Have a great day today.
Let me start with, as you all know, I am one of those CEOs in the Econometer on Sunday, and we slightly beat the economists, so go CEOs on forecasting. When I say slightly, I mean slightly. Welcome. I'm here with not my Manpower hat on today, but my San Diego Workforce Partnership hat on. As chair of the board, we are very happy to be involved with this every year, and I'm going to take a little different track here this morning. This morning, you're going to hear about unemployment is 3.3%, the lowest it's ever been in 17 years. You're going to hear it's an employers market. We are desperately in need of good workers, and everything sounds like a utopia. That's my Manpower hat on. Now that I have my San Diego Workforce Partnership hat on, there's two people I want you to keep in mind as we go through this conversation and how we can all be involved in this process to help this group of people. First is what we call our opportunity youth, being very optimistic here. There are 43,000 young people in San Diego County between the ages of 16 and 24 that are not working and are not in school. Now think about that age group with a lot of free time on their hands. And unfortunately, they become the pipeline, if we don't do something about it, to our other program, which is working with people who are in Las Colinas and East County Detention Center. And we have opened career centers in each one of those because those people have plenty of time on their hands to start thinking about and working on a career plan and interviewing skills and resume writing and all those processes that we all need to succeed at to have a job when they get out. Our goal is that they all have full employment within 3 months of getting out of prison. We're doing much better on that number. So once we focus on them while they have time to focus on this, and as employers, keep in mind, ban the box no longer means we don't want a super Kmart in our territory. It means we don't ask about a prison record until we have a job for someone, and then we specifically can't hire them because of that felony and that specific jobs. So we're very supportive of that of the workforce partnerships. But as we hear this good news, know that the 3.3% unemployment is made up of engineers and programmers that have 0.5% unemployment, and the groups I'm talking about that still have the 10, 12, and 14% unemployment. So please keep those programs in mind as you hear about the wonderful things that are going on, and we're all forecasting for 2018 and how we can all jump on board and help these people that need our support. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Again, this is, if you came in late, this is Philip Molnar here and Roger Scholey from the San Diego Union Tribune. So this year, I mentioned in the beginning, organizers went green to minimize the impact on the environment, but presentations are available online after the event. So if you didn't pick up conference materials, which include the agenda, notes page, evaluation form, those will be there. Okay, so this is our second year moderating the event. Last year, it was a few days before the presidential inauguration, and so that was dominating a lot of the talk, but I'll turn it over to my colleague for some maybe moderator comments.
Thank you, Phil, and welcome from me as well. I've been covering and helping on moderating this for some time, and I guess the headline for today is there's no news because everything is great. Unemployment is down, the stock market is up, interest rates are low. If you're a homeowner, your housing prices are above the last peak, so they're record territory. But here we are with the economists and business leaders, and I wanted to pass along one little bit of advice from J.K. Galbraith, who said, The only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look good. We did have some sort of bad news today that San Diego is not one of the 20 places picked in the second round of Amazon's choice of a second headquarters. But LA is, so we can be happy for them if they get it. The stock market went up record territory yesterday, but now it's down some 80 points, somebody told me a little bit ago, so that's a bit of a fallback from yesterday. But I think instead of hearing a lot of doom and gloom, we're going to hear some interesting things from our panelists today. You'll hear that 2018 will be the same as 2017, that the glass is all full, that the workforce partnership is going to be urging businesses to produce educated workforce members, not just consume them when they hire them. We'll hear about housing, and maybe a downtown arena. We'll hear about the onslaught of tens of thousands of senior citizens who will need care in the year 2050. And finally, we'll hear about an interesting innovation for a maritime themed academy in San Diego. So with that, we're going to start with Phil is going to give the introductions to our first panel.
Okay, thanks a lot, Roger. Okay, so after the speaker presentations, we're going to have a few questions followed by a 15-minute break. We encourage everybody here to write down questions on a sheet of paper during the presentations and give them to planning committee members that are going to be walking around. And we'll collect the questions during and after the break. I know last year we got some really, really great questions. So, okay, so our first panelist is Ray Major, the Chief Economist of SANDAG.
Thank you very much. After 10 years of nearly no growth, I have to speak in defense of the economists who predicted what was going to happen this year. I mean, who would have thought that if I stood up here last year and said, yes, I believe that the Dow is going to go up 46% in the next year, I mean, how seriously would you have taken me? I mean, mortgage interest rates that they said were still low, but what if I said something like, that companies will be hiring throughout the nation, and Apple's going to repatriate $250 billion and bring back 20,000 jobs to the U.S. You guys would have thrown bananas at me, right? And I saw this morning, it's the lowest jobless claim since 1973. Okay, that's another thing that I don't think any economist could have really predicted. So, with that, let's talk about the $220 billion economy, which is San Diego, and what we have in store for the future. If I can get the slides to go forward. At SANDAG, we've been working on our long-term economic forecasts, and the first thing I wanted to just talk about is what does the region have in store in terms of population? Because all of us here have to have places to live, we have to have jobs to work at, and when we take a look at the forecast, this is the forecast that we've done over the last 4 years, you'll see that it's been tempered a little bit. Our forecast this year aligns with the Department of Finance forecast from California, and what we see is about 650,000 additional people living here in the San Diego region by 2050. Okay? So growth continues. A lot of this is natural increase, so there's more births that are occurring in the region than deaths, and there is a component of this that is in migration. Turning our focus to jobs in San Diego. Let's take a look at what happened with employment. If you remember, how many people remember the Great Recession? I mean, that's all we talked about for a decade up until last year, right? And now it's all about the expansion. Well, this kind of shows what happened to employment during the Great Recession. We had a peak of about 1.35 million people working here in San Diego. And then you see that we went into the recession. We lost about 150,000 people, and we hit a trough in about January of 2010. It took us 78 months to recover from that. recession. That was one of the longest recoveries that we ever had. Usually it takes about 2 years to come out of a recession, and this was a really slow grind that I think everybody remembers. But as you can see, since 2014, we've continued to add jobs. We're now in our 8th year of expansion, so we're 96 months of expansion. If I had to step out on a limb, I would say that looking forward to 2018 and 2019, we'll see continued job expansion. And so what we'll see is possibly, coming up here, one of the longest expansions in economic history. So let's take a look at the San Diego labor market and what happened. When you take a look at the brown bars here, this represents total non-farm employment. The green line represents the unemployment rate. And what you can see is that as we lost jobs during the recession, so bars go down, you see unemployment rate went up. Unemployment rate went up to almost 11%. And what you see is as we move forward to the end of the graph towards October 2017, and these trends have continued, employment has continued to increase. We now have about 1.56 million people working in the San Diego region, and our unemployment rate is at historic lows at rates like 3.4%. So it's becoming very difficult for employers to find trained workforce right now. So where were those increases happening over the last year? This is kind of a recap of 2017. In terms of the fastest growing sectors, we saw education and healthcare add about 9,100 jobs. So that's about a 2.5% increase in number of jobs. And we also saw the leisure and hospitality. So that's includes the hotel, motel industry as well as restaurant industry, added about 2,800 jobs. In terms of the fastest growing sectors in terms of percentage, we saw real estate increasing by about 5.5% and financial services up about 3.2%. So that kind of goes with what's happening, where real estate is happening as is the stock market. In terms of the biggest losers, we saw utility sector fall, as well as transportation and warehousing, which also lost employment. When we take a look at wages, so jobs are important because people need to work, but we also need to look at wages. And this is what's happened to wages in the county over the last 10 years. So this takes us back to the bottom of the recession, and this is indexed. So what you see is that over the last 10 years in nominal dollars, so those are the dollars that you actually take home, wages have increased by about 21% for the lowest quartile of earners, 21% now for the median, and 24% for the highest quartile. So the yellow line represents the highest quartile of earners, the blue line, the lowest quartile. Interestingly, though, when we correct this for inflation, this is the story that you see. And that is that over the last 10 years, even the highest quartile of earners have only increased their wages in real dollar terms by about 2.55%. So divide that by 10, that's about 0.25% per year real wage increase. How many people feel that the prices of the things that you bought have gone up more than 0.25% per year over the last 10 years? Okay, this is the problem. This is why, even though the economy seems like it's recovering, we're putting out lots of good numbers and lots of jobs, unemployment, the wages really haven't been there. What we've seen, though, on the bottom, as the labor market starts to tighten, is that there is some wage pressure on the bottom, and the lowest earners have started to gain some ground in terms of employment. So we've increased there. You see that they've increased by 0.04%. So essentially, they're making the same amount of money now as they were 10 years ago. That's the bottom line. So where's the forecasts? Where are the occupations coming from for the next 10 years? This data comes from the EDD. I know it's a little bit hard to read, but this is the top 20 occupations that in San Diego in terms of job creation. And the ones that are blue are all in the lowest quartile of earners. The ones that are in yellow are in the top quartile, and the ones in orange, and I know there are no orange ones, are in the middle quartile. So for our top 20 sectors that earn, they're retail salespeople, waiters and waitresses, cashiers, food preparation workers, personal health care aides, office clerks, things like that. The three occupations that are growing over the forecast period are general and operation managers, registered nurses, and accountants and auditors. Okay? So that's where the growth is in San Diego in terms of sheer numbers. This doesn't mean that there isn't growth in other sectors, but in terms of volume, the largest ones, this is it. The thing I wanted to point out here is look at the average wage or the median annual wage for the occupations that are in blue. You're looking at wages in the $20,000 to $30,000 a year range. Okay? Imagine living in San Diego on a wage of $20,000 to $30,000, given what the price of housing is, the price of gasoline, et cetera. It's a very difficult situation that we're creating here for entry-level workers. Turning our focus to housing, I just want to talk a little bit about the supply and demand side of housing. This is the supply side. This is the permits that are issued. It's the beginning of the housing cycle. The things to note over here, the blue lines represent single-family permits. The green lines represent multifamily permits. Before the recession, about 60% of the housing units that we built here in the region were single-family homes, and about 40% were multifamily homes. After the recession, we see kind of a reversal, with about 3/4 of the homes that are being built are now multifamily or attached dwelling units. But what's more perplexing and more difficult for the citizenry is the fact that as we went into the recession, we created a deficit of housing here in the region. Just by natural increase, having more people in the region, people being ready to buy homes, there's a demand for about 13,000 units per year that we need to be able to fill to accommodate that population that I was talking about. And what's happened between 2007 and 2016 is a deficit of about 60,000 units. And we don't really see permits increasing too much more. So you can see, in order for us to make up that deficit, we'd have to be building probably 20,000 to 30,000 units per year for a considerable period of time. And I don't see that in the forecast. So the supply side is going to be difficult from the housing perspective. So taking a look at what's happened in terms of housing prices, take a look at the forecast. You see that during the recession, the number of units, which are in the brown bars, so how many houses were sold, fell. And then you see that it's kind of leveled off. It's been pretty stagnant since we recovered from the recession. However, housing prices, which are indicated by the green line, have increased dramatically. Okay? So the volume hasn't gone up, but prices have gone up significantly. Okay, so this too makes it very difficult for people, especially first-time home buyers, to get into the market and buy something when you're looking at housing, median housing prices of about $600,000. Okay, I don't see this changing much in the forecast period. When we look at the housing price index, this takes a look at the houses by price category. You see that the highest tier houses, which are in the green, actually increased the least in percentage terms, followed by the mid houses, and then the blue line, which represents the lowest third of the housing, increased the most in terms of price. So this is really where the houses are affordable. These are houses that are $480,000 and below. Okay? They're in the highest demand. These are also the houses that happen to be grabbed up and rented out as Airbnbs in very desirable areas of the city. So that's another problem that I think is actually exacerbating the low end of the market. But with that, when we take a look at housing prices, and I think housing prices continue to increase in the next couple of years, that would be my forecast. We look at the affordability index. The affordability index talks about your ability to purchase a house. It's the inverse, really, of the recession. At the height of the market, what we saw was about 9% of the people were able to afford the mortgage on their home. As we went into the recession, interest rates came down, and housing prices came down, and about 46% of the people were able to afford a house. Right now, we're at about 26%. The only difference between the 26% and the 9% is interest rates, because the prices are back to where they were at the peak in 2006. The difference is that interest rates are over 6% and in 2007, and we still have low interest rates. Expect interest rates to rise in the next year. In terms of affordability, just to give you an idea of what it takes to afford a house in San Diego, the median housing price in San Diego, about $593,000, requires dual income, so two people with incomes of $84,300 in order to afford an 80% mortgage on that property. The problem is that the average income in San Diego is about $55,000. So that means two people earning the average income in San Diego would be able to afford a house of around $433,000. A single person trying to buy a house who earns the median income, you're looking at them being able to afford a unit that's about $232,000. Okay? Housing affordability, from my perspective, one of the biggest issues in San Diego for 2018 and in the future. So just a real quick outlook for 2018, what I see happening. I think the economy continues to expand through 2018 and also through 2019. Everything has been kind of aligned to make that happen. I think if we see slowing, it's going to happen around 2020. The lower corporate and personal tax rates that were just passed bode well for investment and consumption from a national perspective, so you'll see continued economic activity coming from there. Low unemployment rates are going to start to put pressure on wages, which is good for wage earners, maybe reverse the trends that I talked about earlier. Some of the deregulation and tax reforms that support really stronger investment and help lift productivity within industries, which is good. But locally, the tax cuts could potentially temper the economic growth, and it has to do with the fact that our housing is so expensive and many people cannot deduct their mortgage interest. So I don't know what the true ramification of this is, but this is something that I would watch in the next couple of years. And then I think that as we move forward, the Fed is already positioned to raise rates a couple of times next year. We're looking at increased mortgage rates that affect the affordability of housing here in San Diego. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ray. That was really good news and maybe bad news, but not for a couple of years. So that's reassuring at the moment. Next speaker up is Ryan Radcliffe, Associate Professor of Economics at University of San Diego School of Business. He specializes in forecasting macroeconomics and financial economics. And Ryan, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to start just by echoing my dean's comments from before. I'm just thrilled to see everybody here. This opportunity to bring together business leaders, policy experts, and academics like me to all talk about what's going on in San Diego is always, I get a lot out of this, way more than I put in. So just thank you for joining us today. Let me see if I can get squared away here. All right, so, once upon a time I was a professional forecaster, and I'd give you the litany of exactly, here's my number for this and that. But as I move to more of a professor role, I'm thinking a lot more about why things are happening now. And so what I want to accomplish with my presentation is to give you a little bit of a behind the scenes in my thought process about as I'm thinking about what do I expect to see in 2018, what do I expect to see in 2019. The things that are on my mind. So some of this is going to be about the data, and some of this is going to be about why we think the data does what it does. And one of the themes is going to be that we are in very odd times where the economy looks good, but the things we typically expect to see in this kind of economy aren't really happening. And some of that's good news, and some of that's maybe not so good news. And so I just want to, like I say, kind of pull the curtain back and tell you a little bit about what I'm thinking about and how that's going to inform the opinion that I'll share with you at the end. So really the overarching theme for me is, we heard a little bit of this already, but we are nearing historically unprecedented territory here. So right now we're just looking at U.S. unemployment rate, and I think one of my mentors in the field of economic forecasting always said you want to know one number to look at for the business cycle, it's the unemployment rate. Hand your 7-year-old a crayon and ask her to color when the spikes in unemployment occur, and you're going to get all the official recession dates. And so I think as you kind of march through this picture, you can see that. And what I've labeled here is basically how many months elapsed from the end of the last recession to the beginning of the next one here. So you can see in the early post-war period that recessions kind of came along maybe every 3, 4, 5 years. But the main thing from this picture for me is that we're now 113 months from the end of the last recession, and that has been only the 90s were longer, and I think by the time we hit summer, this will be the longest expansion in post-war history. And so that's good news in one sense, but at the same time, it has me thinking that for me to say that I think we're going to have another 3 years of good times here just flies in the face of the last 60 to 70 years of history. So what I'm trying to come to terms with is this is really about the time we start looking for signs that is there going to be a turning point? Are we going to see something that's going to come along and cause us to think there might be a recession in the next year or so? So that's one of the things, I'm looking around sort of nervously based on this picture thinking, let's look at some of those leading indicators and see, is there a hint of trouble on the horizon yet? So I want to think a little bit about some of those, my go-to indicators on that. So one of the things here is just to look at GDP itself. I always say every time I put up this picture that I could literally talk about this for 45 minutes, but I don't spare everybody that. But on the left side of the graph here, this bar graph always takes a little bit of interpretation. So each bar here is one of the kind of headline numbers for GDP grew at 2.5% this quarter. And what I've done is decomposed it into the contributions that we get from each of the major four categories of spending: consumption and spending, investment spending by firms, purchasing new capital and so on, government purchases, and then the contribution from net exports. And so I think the first thing I see in that picture is, for a long time, that the green bar is the big story here. Our economy for the last several years is primarily being driven by consumption growth. That's nothing new. Consumption is about 70% of GDP in a year. So that's always going to be the biggest source of growth. But the number two source is typically that red bar. And I think if you kind of go back to 11 and 12, you can see big red bars quarter after quarter after quarter. That's the firms in the economy doing capital expenditures, buying new equipment, buying new facilities. Residential home construction also shows up in that category. But these are basically big ticket purchases that really smart people spend a lot of time thinking about the future when you put that kind of money on the line, right? Am I going to buy a new factory? Am I going to expand my existing plant? I'm going to think a lot about, well, what do I think market conditions are going to be in the future? So if you're looking for the part of GDP that typically is a bellwether for what's going to happen in the future, investment spending is where I would look. And so around this time last year, so I want you to kind of pull your eyes to 2015 and 2016 in this picture. What you're going to see is there's several places where the red bar is either really small or actually in negative territory here. And so this was a sign that businesses were doing less investment spending than they were before. And that's one of the signs where I think you go back and look at all the recessions we've seen since World War II. The first piece of spending that you see trouble in is firms with this forward-looking investment spending they're doing. So if you'd caught me about this time last year, I would have been concerned about that. And I was. When I went to do this kind of presentation around town, I was saying this is something I'm keeping a very close eye on. I want to know a little bit more about what's going on with that, and also see if that trend continues. So the graph on the right is basically unpacking that a little bit, the different types of investment spending that there are. Unfortunately, the label of that turned out to be like 3-point font, so I'll tell you the short version of what each of these lines is here. The blue line is non-residential construction, so think about commercial real estate, and I think that would be the easiest way to interpret that. And that's sort of the first line, I think, that you see. It was growing pretty strong in 2014. We hit first quarter of 2015, and we start to see it cross over into negative territory, and through most of 15 and some of 16 that we'd actually seen a decline in growth in that category. So we were seeing kind of trouble in the commercial real estate space a little bit. The green, equipment, spending by firms on equipment and kind of the tools that make workers more productive. That was also in negative territory in late 15, early 16. So the two of those together, that's, again, these are firms making decisions that I'm not quite as optimistic about where I think what my market looks like in the future. And so I'm going to pull back on my plans for expansion a little bit. So like I said, sort of about this time last year, mid-16, these were worrying signs to me. But you look at the last 4 quarters or so, you see the red bars now back in positive territory, and you see those two types of spending have actually moved back to growth now. So we're seeing that one of the things that's happened in the last 4 to 5 quarters is that sort of slowdown in business spending that is so crucially dependent on the future outlook is actually better than it was last year. So I am more optimistic now than I was last year, based on the fact that I'm seeing firms are expanding again. Firms are putting big money down on bets that I'm going to invest in something now that's going to pay off in the future, and I think that's going to that investment's worthwhile to do. So I think this is firms are looking more optimistic. Now, the red line is the one I haven't talked about yet, and I said that's the construction of residential real estate. And so this is nationwide here. So you saw it was pretty strong again. It was the one positive category when the other two were negative, but last few quarters we've seen that slow down. We're not building as many new homes at a national level as we were before. So, again, this tug of war between the investment spending that firms are doing is looking a little bit more optimistic recently. It makes me feel a little bit better about the prospects for 2018, but I am going to keep an eye on that residential real estate because that is also one of the kind of prime indicators of a slowdown in home construction is typically something that about 9 to 12 months after you see that happen, you'll often see kind of broader trouble in the economy. So I would sum this up as there's nothing here that I see that makes me think there's trouble in that 9 to 12 month window, but it's trending in the direction that I may come back in 6 months and say, well, this moved in the direction that I didn't want to see it. So, like I say, again, it's a bit better than it was last year, but I still want to keep a close eye on that. So next I want to turn to kind of my attempt to get inside the head of the Federal Reserve a little bit here. So the Federal Reserve, of course, has a twin mandate. The two things they're supposed to ensure are maximum employment, by which we really mean keep unemployment somewhere in the zip code of 5%, and stable prices, which in times past would be we want to see inflation about 2% or so. So as we're thinking about, we've been in a real long expansion here, and we're in a cycle now where the Fed is raising interest rates a little bit. Typically what you would see in that circumstance in the past, if we kind of go back and look at the late 80s leading into that early 90s recession, and then the late 90s leading into the 2001 recession, you kind of see a combination of unemployment is bottoming out, and at the same time inflation is starting to rise a bit, right? And that's a very typical, almost textbook kind of end of the business cycle. The Federal Reserve is raising interest rates because of that concern with inflation, that the real tight labor market is starting to drive up wages. And so this is kind of what we tend to see, right? Remember, this whole thing is about me thinking, when is the end of this historically long expansion coming? This is one of the things I'm looking at again. And I would say it looking at this picture, and in fact, the chair of the Federal Reserve herself said this near the end of last year, that I'm not sure we understand why inflation is doing what it does anymore. And that's a pretty startling thing to hear from the chair of the Federal Reserve. So what we see here is that unemployment is at historically low levels in recent history anyway. And we have seen some uptick in inflation recently, but I think if you look at the raw number, we're still talking about inflation that's in the 2 to 2.5% zone. So as the Fed is trying to think about where are we going to take interest rates in 2018 here, there started to be a little more dissent about how much should we be raising interest rates in the face of this inflation that's not happening the way it usually does at this point in the expansion. So there's not, I'll talk a little bit more next time in a slide or two about what I expect the Fed to do, but you can kind of see a conundrum here. We're in a place that's a little bit different than what the normal playbook says we should be seeing, and so the Fed itself is fairly freely admitting, I'm not sure what we should do here. Should we keep raising interest rates even though inflation's not really there, or just to kind of get back to normal? Or should the lack of inflation be a sign that we can keep interest rates a little bit lower for a little bit longer? That's kind of the debate going on right now. And so I think understanding that the Fed is in a little bit of I'm not sure what's going on here, and so we're a little bit, there's not really as much of a consensus as there sometimes is about what the Fed should be doing right now. Again, one of the things I'm going to be paying very close attention to in 2018 and kind of how the Fed's discussion of this develops. So on the theme of inflation's not doing what it normally does. If unemployment is this low, typically what I would be telling my students is that this is a situation where firms are trying very hard to get workers, and there aren't enough workers to go around, so you have to pay more to get them to come work for you instead of somebody else. So you expect to see wage pressure in this environment. And we already saw a little bit of discussion about it at the San Diego level, but I want to go further and say, just as a kind of academic economist, that one of the great puzzles in macroeconomics in the last 20 years or so, I think, has been this picture, that in the U.S. as a whole. So why are we seeing, we saw at the San Diego level, and this picture will reinforce it at the national level. So the light blue line there is kind of the total, both of your wages and your benefits that you earn in an hour, adjusted for inflation. And what you see there is that since 1970, we've seen pretty anemic growth in that. Now, the puzzle of this is productivity. How much extra output are you getting out of an hour of work has grown significantly faster. And one of the kind of core things we say in micro is that workers basically get paid according to the value they generate for the firm, right? If you're working for an hour and making me output that I can sell for this amount of money, you're supposed to share in that revenue. And one of the things we've seen is that link doesn't work the way it used to. You can see 50, 60, 70, they're moving together, that productivity gains are being shared with hourly compensation. And what we're seeing here is productivity is growing significantly faster than hourly compensation is. So I think, why is wage growth so slow? This is one of the things that nobody has a good answer to. I can give you literally 6 or 7, why are these numbers doing what they're doing? It's about is manufacturing becoming more capital intensive, right? This story that manufacturing employment has dropped significantly in the last 20 years, yet we're making more output than we ever did. Is it an industry mix sort of story about how we're seeing growth at the high-end jobs and the low-end jobs, but the kind of the middle-end, the middle-income jobs for lower skill levels aren't there, right? There's 100 explanations for what this is, but none of them really have stuck out as the explanation for this. So in the sense of, where's the wage pressure? Right? Where is that inflation that's going to cause the Fed to move to a more aggressive set of interest rate increases? One of the big things that I just have to stand up here and confess that I don't know the answer to this, and I don't think anybody, we have lots of theories about why, but we're still trying to figure this out, that wages aren't doing what every economics textbook says wages are supposed to do when you see this kind of productivity growth. And so trying to figure this out, both in a general context and then specifically what it's going to do in the context of the Fed decision, is one of the things that I'm, wake up every day thinking about, frankly. I think also while we're here, I'm happy to answer questions about kind of the economic impacts of the tax cuts, but one of the more optimistic stories you hear about the effect of the tax cuts is that the tax cuts are going to unleash a wave of investment spending. I think we may be seeing a little bit of that already. That's going to lead to a massive increase in productivity, and the connection that this is going to then filter back to a increase in middle-class wages is why this is going to be good for everybody. And unfortunately, I think that flies in the face of what you see in the data here, that we've seen productivity gains for many, many, many years here that have not turned into wage gains. So I think, that story in particular, that we're going to see a significant boost to wage growth from the tax cuts, again, I'm skeptical of it given this picture. So to continue on with the Fed, I think, if you put me on a desert island and said you get exactly one economic indicator to look at to decide when the next recession is going to happen, this is the one I would pick. Not necessarily because there is a theoretical reason for it, but because just the proof is in the tape. If you kind of wind back again to 1950 and run this forward, this one has been gotten the most recession calls correct and had the fewest false positives, where you're saying we're going to have a recession in 9 months and you don't. So what this is a so-called slope of the yield curve. We're going to compare the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury bond to you can use the T-bill here like I'm doing. You can use the federal funds rate as well. So you look at the graph and you see on average this is a 2 to 3 kind of % thing historically, that investing interest rates in the long term are typically higher than they are in the short term. But every now and again you see this kind of odd situation where the interest rate on these very, very short-term bonds and these 10-year bonds moves towards being equal, so that would be the dark zero line there, or actually kind of the odd situation where you get paid a higher interest rate investing for 3 months than you do and you invest for 10 years, which is this situation that we call the inverted yield curve. Now you can see a little bit of this. I only went back to 82, but this actually holds up all the way back to the 50s, and it holds up across countries. That inverted yield curve, if you kind of look for where my graph is crossing zero, the gray bars are the official recession dates, and what you can see there is every time that this number has crossed zero, 9 to 12 months later, we've seen the official kind of beginning of a recession. So like I said, this is kind of my go-to of if this one starts to say recession, I start to pay a lot more attention because historically this has been one of our best at yeses without crying wolf too much. So we're not there yet, right? We're at about a 1% differential between the 10-year and the 3-month right now. But if the Fed makes good on the kind of market expectation of another 3 25 basis point rate increases, we're taking it up about 0.75 or maybe 1%, we start to get very close to zero if the 10-year stays in the range that it is right now. So again, not anything that I see right now in this picture that makes me say, oh, in 9 months we're in trouble. But this is if things go the way they're going to say, it's about fall or so, we could be close to zero here, and that would start to make me worry a little bit more, again, about 9 to 12 months from now. So that would put us kind of mid-19, based on just sort of extrapolate this out and look for trouble a little bit. I mean, like I say, I'm actually, sort of well, let me think about the worst case scenario and how likely is it, and this is what I'm sort of fishing for here. If you extrapolate this out and sort of say, the 10-year is going to stay where it is and the 3-month is going to come up, then maybe we're going to see something in this indicator that points to trouble maybe next summer or so. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm going to say this is one thing that I'm going to be paying attention to as we move into the summer. Okay, so now that I've kind of pulled back the curtain a little bit on the things that I'm thinking about, let me kind of talk about my current opinion of turning these into an actual outlook here. Again, like astrology, here you go. Take it for what it's worth. Again, the main thing for me, the current expansion is very old. You can't get around that. Anybody who tells you we're going to have another 5 or 6 years of 3% growth, you just want to be a little skeptical of that. You want to at least have in the mind that we're getting to the point where when we've been in this kind of economy in the past, it hasn't lasted a whole lot longer. That said, I was more worried this time last year than I am right now based on those trends in investment spending that I was talking about. So I do think the rest of what we've got here, definitely for the first half of the year, probably into Q3 in the fall, the combination of the existing momentum plus the stimulus from the tax cuts that we've seen is going to keep growth at about the same level that we've seen here. So I'm thinking 2.5–3% GDP growth. I'm not expecting that we're going to suddenly discover 7% real GDP growth this year. But again, kind of late this year, early next year, I think there, is when I'm going to start looking for, is there something happening now that makes me worry about next year? Again, and I'm happy to answer specific questions about this when the time comes. We are going to get some stimulus from the tax cut, and I think we've seen some of the, again, those forward-looking investments may have been I think the tax cuts are going to be a reality, and I want to get in position now to take advantage of it. But I do think, honestly, there are some people who are telling what amount to fairy tales about the magic of the tax cuts, that we're going to see that so much GDP growth that we don't get any increase in the deficit. No, that's not going to happen. Substantial positive effect on wages. I can tell you a theoretical story about why that's true, but again, given the productivity picture I showed you, I'm skeptical we're going to see that too. So some of this is wait and see for me, but I do want to say that, tax cuts are stimulative. There's no way around that. So I do expect to see that play out in the next year or so. And I think last but not least, one thing that I think is often overlooked is the U.S. continues to pull a nice trick of, as a nation, we don't save anything, and yet we manage to do a lot of investment spending by our firms. How do you not put much money into the financial market and have a lot of money for firms to take out of the financial market? We pull that trick off in that we receive a lot of financial inflows from the rest of the world. It's sort of the silver lining of our trade deficit, is that we are kind of on the receiving end of net financial flows from abroad. And so that is a major underpinning of kind of our ability to have 70% of GDP be consumption spending and yet still do all the investment spending we do. So I think, one of the things that it keeps us, although frankly, I've been worried about this for 20 years. So one of the things that keeps an economist up at night, though, is going to be if we do something to make our to shut off that inflow. So whether this is kind of a trade war that we start with some of our big trading partners, or whether this is that the rest of the world starts to perceive higher higher risk to holding U.S. financial assets, there's a lot of kind of potential for an international shock to come along and kind of surprise everybody when we're so focused on what's going on domestically. So that's another one of the things that I would keep an eye on. So, I think end of the day, more of the same for at least the next 3 quarters, but there's a lot of stuff, again, just given that timing that the expansion is so old, that I'm going to be keeping an eye on as we move through summer. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. That was very comprehensive. Now we will hear from Sarah Burns, the Director of Business Programs and Research for the San Diego Workforce Partnership. You might have heard her on KPBS this morning. Her team produces labor market research to identify in-demand industries, occupations, and skills here in the county. And she also conducts workshops to train educators and community members to understand, interpret, and use labor market effectively.
Thank you. And thank you, Phil. As you see, I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation, and the fact that our workforce board even has staff dedicated to researching our local labor market really sets us apart from the hundreds of workforce boards in the nation who aren't able to prioritize that as a service for the community. If you're not familiar with what we do, we play this role as an intermediary between employers and job seekers. We run job centers throughout the county where people can come in and take advantage of workshops, hiring events, training programs, computers, printers, phones, anything you need to help you with a job search. On the employer side, we have programs where we work directly with businesses to meet their employment needs, whether that's through reimbursing wages or through helping them to organize and run a cohort of people to train and meet their short-term hiring needs. And we have an impact on the workforce of our economy. As you can see, in the last year, we've reached about 30,000 people through our adult and youth programs. And that includes over 5,000 laid-off workers who we supported in getting back on their feet and reemployed, over 7,000 people who completed training to gain broader skills to progress on their career pathway, and over $1.5 million in reimbursed wages that were invested into our businesses. So one of these services that we provide specifically through our department is our research services. And we identify industries with great potential for business growth, for job growth, really for our job seekers. This particular set we've identified as our 5 priority sectors for San Diego's region. And they are identified in 2013 in partnership with community colleges because of their potential for growth and their relative importance to our region. And you can see that growth has continued for all of them. Really robust in healthcare and life sciences up to 2016, and very positive in clean energy as well, which is made up in a big part by, or influenced by, construction. So we see as that building's picked up, those clean energy investments also. And based on some research that we completed last year, where we surveyed employees across these specific sectors to see what their hiring needs were going to be in the future, between 38% and 58% of employers told us that they're expecting to add new permanent positions in these sectors in the next 12 months. And that's not including replacement due to people who are retiring or people who are turning over. So from the employers, they tell us that their outlook is expansion in terms of jobs. So that's a little on our research side, but really I want to spend time talking to you about 2 workforce development trends that, one which is going to be newer and picking up steam in 2018, and one that I think is going to be accelerated because of the other. And that first one is companies becoming more involved in developing the talent pipeline. As you heard from Ray, it's becoming difficult for companies to find the talent that they need. So what are we going to do about it? And the second is schools investing more in career education, which is something that's been gaining traction and moving and has had huge investments over a number of years. So one approach to this investment by companies is a word that you're going to hear a lot more of and may be familiar to you as an old model, but maybe not resonate as a modern concept. I know when I hear apprenticeships, I always go straight back to blacksmiths in the Revolutionary War. You know, anybody else seeing Hamilton while it's in town? Lots of apprenticeships up on that stage. But the tenet of this model really is earning and learning. So people go through apprenticeships and have a classroom-based component, but also have extensive on-the-job training. And the key is that they're not accumulating debt while going through this training program. They're actually being paid to learn and to work. And it's not philanthropy on parts of businesses. They're investing in these workers. They're getting real work from the skilled workers that are developed. And according to an estimate by the US Department of Labor, they're getting $1.47 back in increased productivity for every dollar that they're investing into apprenticeships. So when we're looking at who is doing this well right now, I just want to give you a couple of models to look at. We know in many European countries there are well-developed apprenticeship systems, and I highlight the Swiss because it's a model that's actually being used in this nation in places. About 70% of students in Switzerland choose to go into apprenticeships, and about 30% of them either remain with the company or return to the company after going to college. And these apprenticeships really span the gamut in terms of their content. It can range from farm workers to bankers. Recruitment starts in 7th grade. And one aspect that I really like is that there are civics and business classes for everyone, regardless of what they're learning in terms of a skill. So as someone put it to me, imagine a world where all of our 18-year-olds, or at least 70% of them, know how to run a business and they know how to run a government. That can be transformational for a community. So one state that's really taken the lead on implementing apprenticeships is Colorado. And this initiative really is new. Their first cohort took off in 2016. And a key point to note is that this isn't led by the state or led by the schools. This is led by industry associations in partnership with the state and the schools. These students go through the programs and they gain industry-recognized certifications and college credit while they're being trained for employment for a skill of some sort in their chosen field. The work around apprenticeships and other earn and learn models is really relevant right now and into 2018 because of some executive orders that have come, well, really just one executive order that's come out of the White House last year. In summer of 2017, specifically promoting expansions in apprenticeships and other earn and learn models. Our local Congresswoman, Susan Davis, as the ranking member of the House Subcommittee on Workforce Development and Higher Education, is really taking a lead in this right now as they're working to reauthorize the Higher Education Act in the House. So if it's something you're interested and want to get involved with, that's really relevant right now, and that's happening. So in 2018, as a result of this work, I expect apprenticeships or other earn and learn models to be one of the ways that companies will have the opportunity to take more part in developing their own pipelines. And this other trend that's really been moving and I think will be accelerated because of the focus on earn and learn models and apprenticeships is increased career awareness in schools. There's this acknowledgement by our school community, by the state. They've invested $1.5 billion since 2014 in career pathways grants and career technical education grants. And we see some really great things happening in our schools in partnerships with businesses. And there are little ways that even small businesses to large businesses can take part in this. One is making your employees as accessible and flexible. You may be hearing asks from schools to have people come in and work with students, give presentations, help to advise on projects that teachers might be planning. You can sponsor career awareness activities if businesses have those, participating in advisory councils or working with colleges to create or revamp programs of study and helping them to be more nimble and more responsive to the business needs that our economy has. So one of the things that our organization is doing to help to support this is creating collateral for teachers to use in their classrooms. We have some 2-pagers that overview our priority sectors and show where are the jobs that are growing. Registered nurses, as you heard earlier, is one of those growing in demand jobs that has great wages, and especially in specialties, there's a lot of demand for nurses. But it gives this overview of high school diploma, associate's degree, what kind of education do you need to get these jobs, and what kind of wage can you expect from them? And like Phil introduced you to, while all this work is happening in schools, it has the potential to really plug some of those holes in our pipeline. We have approximately 43,000 opportunity youth based on some research we completed last year. And again, it's 9.7% of San Diegans in this age range, 16 to 24, who are disconnected from both work and school. And so if we're able to connect students better to promising pathways, and we're able to engage as businesses and educators around those pathways, then we can prevent them from getting disconnected in the first place. So the work that's going on around this is growing and also picking up momentum. If it's something that you are passionate about or interested in, there's going to be a summit on April 12th at the Town and Country Center, so you can keep your eyes out for that to talk about Opportunity Youth and how we can help to reconnect or keep them from becoming disconnected in the future. So in summary, it's really about businesses becoming producers rather than just consumers of talent. And that's really the key phrase. Again, it's been put to me in that way, and it resonated as how we can move forward and make sure that we're producing the talent we need. We're being nimble as an economy and a society and meeting the workforce demands that are coming at us, and that we're helping to nourish the workforce that we need to grow. So thank you very much.
Thank you for those great presentations. Now we will be asking some questions of our panelists. And I'll start here with Roger first.
Okay, this is to Ryan, perhaps, and Ray can weigh in as well. What do you think of the state government's outlook for 2018 and how the state budget and various programs might impact the local economy?
Go ahead. Thank you. So that's focusing my presentation on the national question. I think I have to say first that I probably am not as up to speed on the details of kind of the recent budget proposal as I should be to really give you an answer to that question. But I will tell you one thing, kind of in the spirit of my presentation about California specifically, is the nature of our tax system, the progressive nature of it in particular, where we have higher income individuals paying a higher share of that income as taxes, means that a lot of state revenue is linked to non-wage income, things like the stock market and other investments, which means that we are always in a very, very boom and bust revenue situation. So as I start to think here about, the stock market's doing great and the economy as a whole seems to have some momentum, and we're seeing all of these good things that are going to make for a good revenue outlook right now. At the same time, I've been watching the California economy long enough to know that, well, this is exactly the time when we commit to a bunch of expensive spending, and then a year or two from now, revenue falls through the floor, and we have to spend a lot and make a lot of painful decisions about cuts that we have to make. So this is always, at this point in an expansion, thinking about California always makes me a little fretful, just because I've seen this revenue boom and bust cycle play out, where this is the great time when we can finally do all of those programs that we've wanted to do. I mean, at one point, yes, but at another point, realizing this revenue isn't going to stick.
it's, you know, when we have this reckoning, whether it's middle of next year or 2020, maybe as Ray's thinking, that you know, I'd like to see a little more recognition of that in our budgeting decisions. How that's going to filter down to the local level, yeah, sorry, I have to just say I haven't seen enough of the budget specifics to really offer much on that.
From my perspective, the California situation is a mess. It always has been. The regulations that are imposed upon people trying to either, you know, build housing or create jobs is incredibly onerous in the state right now. You know, we have an interesting situation in the state that we are in big part driven by the Silicon Valley economy, and we're very lucky to have that happening. You know, you take a look at California economy, we're the 6th largest economy in the world if we were a country in and of ourselves. But the problem is when there is a recession, and there will be a recession, and we're 6 months off on our forecast, so that's not, you know, it's like not like night and day, but it's coming. And when it comes, if it happens in high tech particularly, it's going to be devastating for the state. I mean, this is we spend our money on things like high-speed rail, you know, which is over budget, costing billions of dollars that should be invested in other things. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of the way that the California economy or the budget situation is.
All right, excellent. So our first audience question concerns Bitcoin. I'm not totally surprised, but earlier this week I went pretty deep into cryptocurrencies. I wrote a story about Bitcoin ATMs in San Diego County. So we went from about 5 in 2015 to 27 last year. So we've seen some local growth, but the question from the audience says, who on the panel owns some amount of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies?
Nobody.
Not me.
Okay, well, if you don't own any, I guess, what do you think about Bitcoin in general?
I don't know. It's complete speculation. It's like the tulip bulbs in the 1600s. You know, I mean, it's the investment. It's speculative investment, and yeah, I'm not a big fan of Bitcoin. So
I would just go with the the idea that this is a viable replacement for dollars and euros and pesos and yen and so on. You know, one of the features that's kind of a bad news thing when you're thinking about a monetary asset is that monetary asset is increasing in value over time. Well, nobody wants to spend that. You want to hold it and spend it later when it's worth more. And if everybody's holding on to money instead of spending it, money doesn't work anymore. So, you know, the idea that I think, you know, there's a certain niche of ransomware and interesting dark web transactions and all that, where it is actually an effective currency, but the idea that 10 years from now we're not going to have dollars and euros and yen anymore, we're all just going to be trading cryptocurrencies, I think is just, you know, I heard another statistic recently that just the blockchain ledger itself, you know, can process about 7 transactions a second, and Visa processes 700,000 transactions a second. So just the nature of the high-speed transactions in our economy, you know, being supported by something that operates that slowly is just another, like, well, it's an interesting little thing to watch from the side. But yeah, I've been terrified of owning any Bitcoin for many years now. So.
Sarah, any comments?
Ditto.
Okay. All right.
Okay, well, Sarah, we have a question from the audience for you. What's being done to help re-engage and get older workers back into the workforce as the cost of housing in San Diego makes it hard for them to live? And, of course, experienced workers are great workers.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Experienced workers bring a lot to our economy, and unfortunately, we are working against a bias in many companies against workers who have that experience and that age under their belts. They are more expensive to employ, and because of that, it's a huge investment for an employer for someone who probably isn't going to be hanging around for, well, not 50 years. So what's being done? I'm not familiar with specific initiatives around it, but when you think about what is needed and what kind of sectors that are useful for that work, we see a lot of expansion in retail. And I know that's crazy talk because retail's in an apocalypse right now, apparently. But when we look at our tourism industry in particular, there's a lot of room for older workers to re-engage and be involved in those industries, I think.
Can I just add, this isn't so much a policy, but just more what we see in the data is the labor force participation among the kind of the 55 to 65 cohort and then the 65 to 75 cohort is higher now than it was 10 years ago and 15 years ago. That's some combination of great healthcare makes 60 the new 45. Pick whatever version of that you want. But that we are able to stay healthy and work longer. But I think it's also a combination of I can't really afford to retire right now. So some interaction of those two effects is just that we're seeing a kind of retirement, the ages that we're used to expecting people to retire at. We're seeing much higher labor force participation than we have historically.
And I think we'll hear more from our speaker down the row on that.
All right, excellent. We have another audience question here, and I think they're hinting at presidential politics, so feel free to take a crack at that. Is the improved economy a result of the last 8 years or more from the current policies?
I'm not taking that.
Well, my analogy is when, for those of you who've had kids, it's like, you're walking at SeaWorld or whatever, and they're dragging, and you're pulling them, and all of a sudden, you promise them something like a snow cone, and all of a sudden they run over there, right? So there's energy there that that for some reason wasn't there in this particular case for the last 8 years. When we first started looking at the expansion a year ago, is it really the effect of Trump's policies? I don't know that you can necessarily attribute all of it to Trump's policies as much as you can to people's expectation of what might happen, because he hadn't really implemented anything, and we already saw, he wasn't even elected, and we saw the stock market start, he hadn't taken office, and we had seen the stock market start to increase. So, I think the economy is such a large entity, and I think a lot of this has to do with where businesses think things are going more than the actual policies of the last 8 years or even the what Trump has done this year. The tax cuts will have actual tangible effects, but that's really one of the first things that he's done that is tangible that I think that we can actually measure, and a lot of that's not coming until later this year.
This wasn't asked by an audience member. I thought we should bring it up, and that is the two of you talked about the inevitability of a downturn or a pause, and yet when you think about the huge drop from the Great Recession, maybe the recovery time really will be a lot longer just because we went down so far. So why is that not a likely scenario that economists are considering?
Well, I think there's actually, I'll spare you the statistical details of this because this is a real nerd debate among economists, but the idea is when we have a recession, do we just kind of revert back to normal growth and we forever lost the higher level of GDP we could have had, or do you have a kind of snapback where when you fall, there's some kind of level of GDP we're supposed to be at, and if we're running underneath that, then we're going to go faster than we normally do to catch up with it. And I think there's some evidence on both sides on that one, though I tend to think the data a little more supports the, that you grow faster than average to recover. But I do think one of the other things that that's going on a lot in my circles is just debating about we're so programmed to think that GDP is supposed to grow at 3% because of the labor force is growing at this speed and the amount of tools and equipment they have to work with is growing at this speed and so on, that, we're going to talk about demographics a little bit after the break here, but that with the changing kind of age profile of the workforce combined with just slower overall growth of population, are we just going to see 2.5 as the new normal now? And if that's the case, then as we catch up with slower growth there, are those two things kind of going together? And, at the end of the day, this is the great joy and the frustration of macroeconomics is we don't have the ability to do experiments to figure this stuff out. We can just sort of see it all interact at the same time and try and figure out as best we can what's going on. But I think I do think the kind of our slowdown in the long run trend in GDP is one of the reasons. And it's just I think every time it's a very dangerous thing to do as an economist to say, well, we've seen it kind of plays out this way the last 10 times it's happened, but this one's going to be different. Let me tell you why. I've been that person once or twice, and I hopefully have learned my lesson once or twice from it. But so I think that's the other reason of we could go for another 6, 7, 8 years just based on being so far in the hole from the last recession. I'm sympathetic to that argument, but at the same time, I just say I've never seen that actually happen.
Mm-hmm. Ray, do you have a thought on that?
Sometimes, the economy is cyclical. It has been historically forever, so would expect it to eventually turn around just based upon that. But even like the last recession, when we went into it, there's some kind of shock that occurs in the economy that nobody really saw, and the last one was the whole banking crisis. Does everybody remember that? Mortgage crisis and having to bail out banks and all this kind of stuff. Those type of shocks, some people might see them coming, but typically the economy doesn't see them coming, and then it significantly impacts things, and it totally turns things around, because the banking crisis created the housing crisis, et cetera. So I don't know what the next shock is. What happens with North Korea? Do we get into another war? Does business pull back then from hiring people and investing, and that makes the economy stumble? There's a lot of reasons that this could happen, not just from the statistics, but also just from these external shocks that we can't predict. So my thought is something happens and it turns around.
All right, we have an audience question here. What are the economic opportunities for San Diego on a global scale?
Want to get that?
You go first.
So, in some of the opportunities that San Diego have really focus around the biotech and the high-tech industry. If you take a look at what the industries are that are driving the future, they are the type of businesses that are being spun off right now from UCSD and have been for the last 10 or 15 years. You take a look at companies like Illumina, which have absolutely revolutionized the genetic sequencing. Something that cost $100 million to do in 1997 now costs $59, and you can just mail in a vial of saliva and have your genetics tested. These are going to revolutionize the way that companies look at everything in terms of healthcare and being able to cure diseases and being able to there's a lot of moral issues around it too. Is like what is genetic engineering, but that is the future. Robotics are the future. Drone technology is the future. Driverless vehicles. Those type of things have a presence here in San Diego. Those are the type of things that I see San Diego can be a global leader in.
Eric, you were raising your hand over there.
Yeah, and not that. I just would add maybe a couple more points to what Ray said. First of all, San Diego's been blessed by a collection of research-oriented universities that have spun off innovations and discoveries. But we've seen in regional economic development that's not necessarily enough. And so The other component of San Diego's secret sauce is an ecosystem which is supportive of entrepreneurs and bringing discoveries from the lab to the marketplace. San Diego's great challenge, really, though, is to think about a changing demographic profile of what our region will look like in 30 years, and seeing and really making sure that ecosystem remains inclusive and reaches out to new groups and new kinds of entrepreneurs to continue that success that we've had for really the 20 years. So I think, I would add that second component part and that second challenge that looms on the horizon.
Michael Jones, you wanted to weigh in too briefly?
Well, I look forward to talking about the blue economy and blue tech to you a little bit later, but we are recognized around the world as one of the leading blue tech centers. And just to give you one example, we have 4 of the 6 world leaders in producing acoustic Doppler profiling in San Diego. The other 2 are in Norway. So we are a powerhouse in terms of blue tech, and the ocean economy is growing very rapidly. And we clearly need to work the educational system to bring new entrepreneurs and technical trained people into this area, which I'll talk a little bit later.
And I would just add that in order for us to have all of the opportunities globally that we'd like to, it's going to be important to think about how we make those opportunities available to small businesses, which are really at the core of what's happening in San Diego. When you look at the size of businesses by employees, it's, I believe, over 95% of companies that have fewer than 50 employees. And a large majority of that is fewer than 20 employees. So thinking about how we can stimulate that growth will be important.
And can I add? Yeah.
Yes.
Just lastly, and I think it's for the panelists, when you think about Qualcomm and Broadcom and what's going on there, I think we need to think about a large employer that potentially could change. And so when we talk about, 80 or 90% of our businesses are small businesses, 50 employees or under, that really speaks to making sure our economy is diversified so that if one company leaves, like happened in the early 90s with the defense industry, we are not in trouble. And so I would say we need to focus and help Qualcomm stay where they are.
Okay, we will now introduce Chris Michelle, Chief Operating Officer for Special Projects at the City of San Diego. She manages the special events and corporate sponsorships departments, as well as Civic San Diego and the Commission for Arts and Culture. Additionally, she oversees the city's senior advisor on homeless coordination. Prior to her role in the City of San Diego, she served as president and CEO of the Downtown San Diego Partnership for 7 years. In this position, she oversaw day-to-day operations of the nonprofit organization, which represents more than 11,000 property owners and 350 members in San Diego's urban core. She was also responsible for Clean and Safe, a $10 million program that offers maintenance and safety services throughout 275 blocks in the heart of downtown San Diego.
Well, thank you. Okay, I just want to make sure I can forward. Okay, there we go. Well, good morning, everyone. And I'm thinking, did you do bios for everybody, or was I sleeping?
We forgot for Ray Major.
Okay, that's okay. I'm sorry. I should not have pointed that out. Please disregard. Okay. And I thought, let's just keep this moving. So, okay. So I have so many thoughts about things that are not in my presentation, as always. So I won't share those with you, but I think we had some great panelists earlier, and it really is interesting to see where are we heading. But let me just share with you the span of duties and responsibilities. So I am not responsible for the homelessness, but I do help. So I want to make that clear because the way that's written. And as some of the others that were mentioned, Civic San Diego, and we're going to talk a little bit about that because that is something that we should replicate. And then some large projects or potentially large projects. The Mission Valley site, that is now San Diego County Credit Union. The San Diego Convention Center, a new sports arena distinct from Midway Sports Arena site, Civic Center Plaza site, so you can ask me what that is, and that is the area in which City Hall sits, and Horton Plaza and Horton Plaza Park. Those are large special projects. I'm not going to spend time on those because we're going to talk about housing. But what I will say is that each of those projects has the ability to be a catalytic event for what we really need most, and that is housing. And so like Petco Park, which I worked on for 2 years, that project, and oh, by the way, when I worked on that project, it's not that I wasn't a fan, I didn't understand baseball, to the point that I had to ask where the second base coach was. So those of you who know baseball will know that is the silliest thing to say. I know that now, but I didn't, because you have a first and a third, so you should have a second. But I saw the site plan and I said, wow, that is amazing. And that catalytic event of a baseball park into the fabric of an urban area is something that will create all of the development around it. And so that's what that did. And those large projects, it would be our goal at the city, and certainly the mayor's goals, that if we embark on any of those, we do this with the intent and knowledge of knowing how can we better the community and how can we solve problems rather than create them. And so those are the goals there. But I'm here to talk about housing and the city of San Diego and the mayor, and in particular from a boots on the ground level. So everybody's talked about the population growth. I've always used, and SANDAG's always helped me, thank you so much, Ray, but our region's gonna grow by over 1 million residents over the next 30 years. That's countywide. I don't know if that's accurate, or 35 years, because the years keep growing. And so to accommodate that growth, we need about 400,000 housing units and 500,000 jobs. So every time I say that in a college class, some young man, it's always a man, raises his hand and says, you know what, I don't agree. I just don't agree. And I will say why. And he will say, because we're not having kids. I just don't believe that. And I said, yes, but we're not dying. So you need to understand. So either way, we know we need more housing. And we can see the population growth is at 1.2, housing growth is at 0.5. The amount of units, the shortfall, just by 2020, 50,000 units. The median price, all these numbers, and rent. This is a big problem. And as our mayor stated in his State of the City address, it's about housing, silly. Housing, housing, housing. So we need strategies at the city to address this. And those strategies include the 3. Number 1, increase density. Well, duh. But number 2, reduce costs along with that increase in density. And then number 3, we're gonna think, oh, this is nice, but you don't need to do it. I think actually number 3 is the most important, foster community. Because people live where there's a sense of community. And as we all know, okay, how many millennials in the room? I know everybody hates this question. Okay, great. How many what's after millennial? What's the gen, what is it? Oh, so my niece attends college here. She's a freshman, yay. And I always ask them and everything is experiential. Everything. I want an experience. They don't necessarily want to own things, they want to do things. Well, I've been that way my entire life. And if we want our workforce, our young workforce, to live in communities that have higher density, we have to create this village concept. And believe me, I always thought I was a millennial because I want this too. So I think that, I'm a millennial on the inside, come on, that's not on the outside, so we all know that. But that foster sense of community we'll talk about. So increasing density is not only that, but it's the variety of units and the accessibility. And let me go back to that, because I have some notes on that I want to talk about. In downtown, where I've focused the last 7 years, we have a lot of units going up. But I would not say we have an incredible amount of variety, because the variety is we have high-end units and we have affordable housing, subsidized housing. But we don't have that middle layer of housing. And that is driven in large part by the cost of dense projects. So once you go over 6 stories or podium and 5 stories on top, you change the construction type, and that increases cost dramatically. And so but we need to change that. We need to look at other ways to build. We need to look at new technologies so that we can reduce the cost of not only creating these projects, but building them. And that reduction in cost is going to be critical because it is also our belief we need to put housing, the mayor strongly believes this, housing along the transportation corridors, transit-oriented development. I knew that 35 years ago, but it becomes truer now than ever. So as we, in fact, let me go back to one other thing. As we start to think about what we're going to build, we in San Diego are a very young city. I always say San Diego has to learn, we learned to grow out. I started my career working at the building industry, and that's 35 years ago. Greenfield development, you build a bunch of houses, they all look the same. Hopefully you don't drink at night and go into your neighbor's house when you're going home, but it's all pink houses, there you go. But instead of growing out, we have to learn to grow up. And I mean that literally and figuratively. We have to think differently about this housing. And so micro units, and I don't mean 100 square feet and charge for $8,000. What I mean is we can reduce certain standards to increase our density and make it workforce housing and get more units on a piece of land because land becomes that much more important. It's this infill development that is going to be our future. Granny flats that just was passed, that is a great opportunity for us to help, and it does two things. Number one, it helps the homeowner to either have more income, and number two, it helps younger or older folks or people who can't to have a place to live. So that one thing there will hopefully give a shot in the arm to the number of units we need to have. Transit-oriented development, I just want to stress on that. We need a more sustainable community. Building along transit corridors also helps us know that maybe a family doesn't have two cars, you have one car. I'm going to assert that eventually we'll have few cars. This Uber, this little Uber company, I think it's going somewhere. So I think that it's going to make it, but I'll tell you, a lot of my generation don't really know that yet and don't understand the way people think. And when I say people, I mean the younger generation, that, oh, by the way, you're all going to be paying for us in our retirement, so stay healthy. Okay, and we all know about urban sprawl. Reducing the costs, streamline, streamline, streamline. So we have an example of where it works well. Civic San Diego is an organization that does development permitting under a programmatic EIR, it gets a little techie, and under our community plan. And they provide developers certainty in the marketplace. Developers it's not a bad word. We used to say when I started out, developers was a bad word. We need developers and builders to help us create our new communities. We need certainty in a process that doesn't languish and linger on and on and on. And I'll give you an example. I worked on a workforce housing project in 1999, never got built. But it was a great project. It was a remnant piece of land that the Unified School District had, and we wanted to put 1,000 units on it, and they were small micro units. And we had money on deposit, so it works, and then we kept filling that money on deposit, and never getting anywhere and couldn't figure out. Well, that is not the way to incent a developer to build a project. It doesn't work. If we knew we had an answer within 2 years, whether it's one we liked or didn't, we would take that risk on the front end. But a lot of developers that are good developers won't take that risk unless they know they're going to get an answer, not the answer, but an answer within a certain period of time. And oh, by the way, on that little workforce housing project, what I didn't realize when I started it, and I worked with the developer, is that it was right next to Qualcomm. And so they were like, yeah, we have generators here, that's not gonna help. And they were right. So that wasn't the right place when you have large generators that could be sensitive receptors right next to housing. So we needed to rethink what we were doing. But the concept was right. Take remnant pieces of land that government may not be using and build micro units for our community. Civic does this. They provide, in downtown in particular, development process and provide certainty in that process. So when the money comes in and you have not only a developer, but you have their financial partner come in, they can tell their financial partner, within 3 years, 2 years, 1 year, you will have an answer. May not be the one you like, but you'll get an answer. And so they're willing to take that risk. That is in part, not all, but in part why there's so much development going on in downtown. And the mayor knows this. He's been working on this, and he has asked city staff to look at the model of Civic, us, and to also look at how can we reduce standards? What can we do? And what I mean by reduce standards, and I don't want community folks to get upset, is parking. So there is a developer in downtown that had a 2,500 square foot lot that wanted to build 25 units on it, micro units, 400 square feet, but the parking standards prevented him from doing that. And so he could either build 12 units or 25 units. And so this was probably 4 years ago, couldn't get out of our own way. And unfortunately, he built the 12 units because he got an answer quicker. And so that is something we need to think about. It was right along a transportation corridor. It's for younger workers that would love to live there. It's a vibrant community, but we missed the boat on that. That's something that the mayor has said we're never going to miss the boat on that again. So foster community. This is important. This is placemaking. How many know placemaking? What that is? Placemaking is what you do with spaces between buildings in any community. And that is how you activate the space. I would assert to you that placemaking creates the soul of a city. And so we had one of the experts, Fred Kent, come out here last year to look at and audit some of our places in downtown. And of course, I was very proud. And of course, he said, this is pathetic. And, and it was tough love. But what he's saying is, are people using that space? Is that space being activated? Is it somewhere where you say, hey, let's go downtown because you know something's going to be happening? So public spaces, not just parks. And this is what creates that sense of community, that experience. And so we have to rethink that patch of grass. It's always grass. We think parks are grass. No, it's plazas. It's esplanades. It's all of that. It's programming and activation. Every time I go to New York, I go to their park system. And we all know some of their parks are fantastic, and you think, well, that's New York. We can learn from them. Even the High Line, you learn from the High Line. What the High Line is a linear park, but what's underneath is equally as important now because it's activated the store shops underneath with the park on top. So we are taking a look at all of those from a city perspective and understanding that our housing needs to mesh with this so that we encourage people to live in areas that have the infrastructure for them. And so those are the 3 areas or the 3 strategies that I believe we can do. We need all types of housing. And the only thing I will say is if we don't have this, that we really risk losing companies. 25 years ago, I worked on a project where I interviewed for Ernst & Young companies in the technology and life science space. And they were CEOs, and I asked them, what's your #1 impediment to hiring employees? 25 years ago, it was housing. And that still remains today. So what I think we need to do for you as your government, and what the mayor said in his State of the City address, is that we need to increase our supply, period, and all levels of our supply. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, and we do want to ask you about Qualcomm, the company, and the place, stadium, in the questions and answers. Next up is Eric Bruwald, who previously was a economist at the National University and now has switched over to North County Economic Development Council. He'll probably talk about the council, but he also wants to talk about the prospects of aging in San Diego and how that will be needed to be responded to by more housing. Again, another housing question. So Eric, come on up.
Thank you, Roger. Let's see. And then, there we go. Perfect. Great. So I'm not Doc Brown, and I didn't bring a DeLorean today, but I do feel like sort of we're back to the future. And so Chris's talk, I think, is what Chris Michel said is apropos. At these sorts of gatherings, I think for the last 20, 25 years, we've been talking about one of the key challenges for San Diego, and that's housing, and even more so, the challenge of thinking about really a transition between a community that grew through suburban master plan communities to a community that now is going to have to be able to grow through infill. And so that's when I turned my DeLorean in the backwards mode, and now, like Michael J. Fox, I'm going to turn it forward in the forward mode, and really give you not a perspective or a forecast for next year, but really a forecast for where we're going to be in 30 years. And the transformation that's going to occur in this region because of that change is profound and dramatic, and I think really offers up challenges and opportunities for how we approach things as a community. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you a little bit about my new gig as the CEO of San Diego North Economic Development Council. We're an organization focused on economic development north of State Route 56, so that third of the county where we focus on attraction by marketing the region and working with companies that are interested in expanding and investing in North County. Retention, working on a few issues that impact competitiveness and the ability of those companies to grow, like housing, like healthcare, like transportation. And then talent, fostering our talent pipeline by making sure that we connect companies and K-16 institutions so that they understand what is needed. As I think, got to put there. Really, so what I'm going to do today is talk about what San Diego is going to look like in 2015 and talk about some of the implications in terms of economic composition and workforce participation. There's a yin and a yang that's going to go on in our region as we think about that, and employers and institutions that are prepared for that, I think, are going to be in much better position, and I think then as a region, if we can develop strategies to think about that, we're going to be much further ahead. So this chart gives you some ideas. I apologize to Ray Major. I gave him extra work. This should say Series 13, not Series 15, so much as my time machine was broken in a couple of ways, I looked ahead. But this is the SANDAG's most recent forecast, and the key element behind that forecast is outlined in the blue box that shows you just how much the region's going to add in terms of residents over the age of 70 between now and 2050. It's, more than 300,000 we're going to add to that function. And if you think about it, that has really profound implications in terms of what our region looks like, the services that are going to be needed, the kinds of communities that we're going to have to build, and the kind of economy that we're going to have in 2050 as we look at that. This just shows you another way of looking at it, but I think is really pretty illustrative. It shows you our current composition in 2020 by age groups. And so you see, about 1.3 million people in that 30 to 60 age group, sort of prime working years, with an additional 600,000, 630,000 that are located in the 18 to 29-year-old period of age. So that gives you an idea of workforce, and then the 60 to 69-year-olds, people that are going through transitions, though, we'll be a little bit there, and then again, that 70 and over age group. This is what the region looks like in 2050. So we add a little bit more in terms of the prime working age of that 30 to 60-year-olds. Our 18 to 29-year-olds are almost flat over the next 20, 30 years in terms of the projection. A little bit of growth, but not a lot. But this explosion of people that are age 70 and older. Why is that happening? There's, at least 3 reasons. One, household size and birth rates have been declining and have reached sort of a particular state, and that's true across not just the United States, but really all advanced industrial countries. Healthcare is allowing more people to live longer into life, and that's an important development. And then we're also still digesting really this baby boomer generation and then the children of the baby boomers as they work through demographic waves that will be hitting our county and our region. So, apologize for the typo here. It shows maybe that I need to get my Grammarly back on, I think. But 27% of the county's population is going to be over 60 years old by the year 2050. And one of the things I thought that was instructive when I thought about putting this talk together was to ask myself the question, what other large metro areas have a similar percentage of age 60 years and older? Not necessarily that the future is going to be just like today, but we could begin to learn things by thinking about those regions and thinking about how the composition of their economies reflect really how that they serve that particular demographic composition. It's not necessarily apples to apples. There are changes that are there. But when I looked at that, the closest metropolitan area is Tampa, St. Petersburg in terms of an MSA that has a similar sized, sort of larger population MSA, metropolitan statistical area, and that had a similar percentage of what will be in 2015 as they are today. And I thought the most instructive thing was to look at how really that composition changes in terms of the percentage of their workforce and then how that compares to national numbers in terms of that. And the two that move the most, the two that are sort of influenced the most between where San Diego is today, where we are as a nation, and what St. Petersburg is that you can see the expansion in terms of percentage terms of the percentage of workers that are working in healthcare-related areas to support that older population, where San Diego currently is and what the national numbers are. So what did I take away from that comparison? I took away from that comparison not necessarily the most rocket science and earth-shattering observation, but that we'll see an expansion of the percentage of population that's working in healthcare in our region. That's the yin. The yang of it is that if you look at San Diego historically, one of the things that we've done is that we have exceedingly efficient healthcare systems. So we've actually had, even given our population numbers, and if you look at the ratio of a variety of healthcare occupations, we actually do pretty well. And so one of the big challenges that's going to be on the forefront in terms of thinking about our region is, can we continue to have that same efficiency in our healthcare system as we grow older in the region and as people consume more healthcare services that at that age level tend to be the kinds of chronic diseases that one experiences as one ages. That's going to be a really big challenge for how our healthcare system, how our government interfacing with our healthcare system does this, because it's unclear to me, given some of the input side of the equation, that we can really sustain an economy that looks like St. Petersburg does today. And the reason simply is lack of savings, a change in sort of who takes retirement risk, and then again, sort of the ratio between earners and recipients on old age. If we try and operate with under the same existing models of how we deliver care to chronic disease, that kind of population that needs chronic disease care, it's unclear to me that we'll have a sustainable system. The other one that's interesting is just how sort of the lower percentage of workers in St. Petersburg work in education. So this is both K-12 and higher ed, so it combines in the data. It probably reflects San Diego's numbers, reflect that we have a robust higher education system. But if you look at the demographic forecast, there's actually not that much gain in those school-aged and college-aged populations. A little bit, but not that much. And so one of the transitions that we're going to have to be thinking about is how do we deal with land use policies and government policies that really don't have a lot necessarily of demand on the education side, a little bit, but not a lot of growth, but then housing, you know, some 300,000 extra seniors. Now, one of the things I thought I would find when I sort of began this MSA comparison and tried to find, you know, sort of an apples to apples comparison when I thought this, I thought, well, okay, it's a higher percentage of folks that are in their retirement age years, that St. Petersburg, as it sort of digested that through, would show lower rates of growth. And that's actually not the case. If you index back to 2005 and you look at growth rates, Tampa's actually done just about the same as San Diego, and over the most recent couple of years has sort of caught up, and actually indexed for GDP, Tampa's done better. So a lower percentage of the population in the workforce can act as a drain. But on the other side, retirement income has traditionally, but I want to emphasize that word has traditionally had some elements that are similar to some of the economic development strategies we've had in the region. A population or an entity that brings new dollars into a region. And actually, there are medium and small-sized metro areas that have as an explicit economic development strategy attracting retirees because they bring in new dollars both through government transfer and the spending down of savings, so they act somewhat like a company who's selling goods outside the region and bringing new dollars in. But I emphasize the word has, because I think one of the key questions that we've really got to ask ourselves is the new wave of seniors that we're in as the country is going to be absorbing over the next 30 years have savings rates which don't necessarily provide for the kind of income stability and consumption patterns that might be needed. And secondly, which is this transition from how we've assigned retirement risk over the last 20 years. It used to be with defined benefit plans as a more common kind of retirement savings, that the risk was not necessarily on the retiree. The switch to moving toward 401ks and 403bs, clearly the risk is on retirees. And as we look at savings rates, there's a gap between what's been saved and what will need to be spent in senior years. And people know that's coming. People have thought about it. Nobody has, I think, because of the painfulness of that conversation, has really addressed how that's going to play itself out in the region. One of the changes that's going to happen, and I'm going to talk about this, is that older workers are likely to change the workplace. It's a challenge, and I want to talk about one of those ones that's out there. But this chart shows you the average actual, sort of the expectations, and you see since 2002, as Gallup's been polling on this, is that there's been a steady increase from the expectations, what people are reporting, when they expect to retire. So in 2002, people said, we expect to retire in the 2000, sort of at the 63 age range, and that has now crept up to 66. Reality sort of, changes people's expectations and for whatever. And so there's been an undercrease, that's the light green line, but you also see that people have been retiring later, and that delay is about a three-year time frame. That increase from 60 to 62 coincides with sort of the tail end, and as people sort of reacted to their retirement portfolios and their retirement savings coming out of the Great Recession. It could slip back down, but I'm not expecting it to, because another illustrative chart is this labor force. So if we're expecting to see an older workforce as we move through, we also see that labor force participation rates have been on a steady increase. And I think the most instructive lines are the blue and the yellow line here, which shows that in 1988, we had about 4.2% of workers who were 75% and older participating in the labor force. That's doubled by now in 2016, where we've got 8.4%. And perhaps even more striking is the 65-year and older number, where we've gone from about a labor force participation rate of 1 in 10 to now a labor force participation rate in 2016, which is almost 1 in 5 workers that are 65 and older are still participating in the labor force. That has really profound implications, and I think one of the biggest ones is the question about lifelong learning, upskilling, and continuing learning. You know, we've seen a transition, and it just is it's the reality of where we've been, is that we've offloaded training and upskilling and continuous education largely onto employees. We've made, in addition to retirement savings, we've made them responsible largely for that transition. And a question that we have to ask in our higher ed system, our continuing education system, the ways in which people find and generate those skills is, are we prepared to meet the needs of workers in their 40s, 50s, and even in some cases 60s who need to go back and get new training and new skills to be competitive and valued contributors in the workforce. I don't mean this in any snide or rotten way, and it may sound that way in a little bit, but there are only so many jobs and increasingly fewer in retail and in those kinds of areas, and we have got to address and make sure that we find ways to provide productive, meaningful working experiences for this older workforce, because it's coming. We can't simply discount them. If we do, we have to live with a labor force that is not much bigger than what it is today, and yet have a senior population which needs earning power because of the challenges of cost of living and savings rates. So that's, and this is probably going to continue to sound, I guess, you know, I'm putting my economist hats on as sort of the dismal science. This is the other chart that's the worrisome one as we look at a graying San Diego. So this I have to kind of explain a little bit. So this is on the vertical axis. What that shows you is the folks that need assistance with 2 or more activities of daily living, so dressing, bathing, eating, those sorts of things, and then the percentage of who provides that care for them. So what you see in that 15 to 29-year-old period is that individuals that are that aged, that need those experiences, that light blue line, 70% of their needs are being met by parents, and then you see the experience in terms of paid helpers, spouses, daughters, and sons that are providing that. The important number there is that for those folks that are 75 to 84, just how much of their care, those people that need that assistance, are being done by daughters and sons. And so a key question for the region, the nation, in this graying workforce is, how do we, since we're going to have constrained labor participation pools by those folks that are 18 to 59, how do we make sure that we have support services so that they don't need to exit the labor market to care for an aging parent who needs that help? And that's going to be this, if the yin is greater labor force participation by seniors, the yang is people, their sons and daughters being pulled out of the labor force, losing that earning power because that they have to care for an elderly parent. You know, I see this a little bit every day, and I bless my lucky stars that my mom is in a situation where she's got those needs taken care of by herself and her own savings patterns and what have you. But I know that I wouldn't be working, or my mom or my wife wouldn't be working, or a brother or sister wouldn't be working if my mom wasn't as fortunate for that. She's 85 now, she'll be 85 this year, yay. But you know, I understand the healthcare challenges that she faces, and that's going to be an increasingly big challenge for San Diego as it moves forward. So again, I think, you know, I'd like to sort of say, you know, are we prepared as employers for this aging workforce? Unclear to me, but it's coming and we've got to think about it. Everything points to greater participation rates and delays in retirement. Are we ready for the shift in terms of this increasing share of employment to healthcare? pipelines, facilities, and firm structure. We have I think that others can speak better to this than I can in terms of our current healthcare system. But for me, the question is given this increasing demand, are our current systems scalable? And are we really going to be efficient in meeting seniors in increasing need to meet them where they are, as opposed to having them drive to hospitals or healthcare centers or what have you? On the pipeline issue, I just want to say we heard a great presentation and sort of talk about the nursing issue. I'll just put my plug hat for my old affiliation with National. We could fill 5, 6, 7, 8 times our nursing programs. The pipeline's constrained in this state, and we need to deal with it in terms of thinking about where we're going to be going in the region. And then I think, again, the challenges of caregiving. One last thing before I finish. People ask questions about sort of out-migration, in-migration, equity migration, and so forth. What I'd say is we don't yet see that in dramatic numbers. There is some net out-migration by folks that are over 60, but it's not that dramatic. I expected to sort of see, when I looked at the IRS data and the Department of Finance data, tons of San Diegans sort of saying, hallelujah, I'm going, Bend, Oregon, here I come. And that just wasn't the case. So great. What you do see in that data, it gets back to Chris's story, it's rather from a younger demographic in their 20s and 30s, and especially that say, I'm sick of doubling up, I'm ready to have a family, Temecula, here I come. And that, I think, is a challenge that we have for our region. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Michael Jones. He's the founder and president of the Maritime Alliance. It's a nonprofit industry association, and their mission statement is promoting sustainable, science-based ocean and water industries. It was originally focused in San Diego, but it has a growing number of members nationally and internationally. The Alliance is helping promote the creation of regional clusters globally, and in 2017, helped form the Blue Tech Cluster Alliance with 9 leading blue tech clusters from 7 countries.
Thank you for allowing me to come here today. I'm thinking to take a different shift. I'm going to talk about an industry sector. And one thing that we're very bullish on blue tech in 2018. However, there isn't a lot of statistics on this area, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So this is going to be a qualitative as opposed to a quantitative discussion. So first, let me ask a question. How many of you are involved in the oceans? Ocean industries, oceans? 1, 2, a room of several hundred people, 2 or 3 people. How many of you believe the ocean is important to San Diego? Oh, look at that. That's great. How many of you believe that ocean industries are important to San Diego? Good, like that. That's good for my talk. And finally, how many of you have somebody in your family that came home and said, a child that came home and said, I want to be a marine biologist? Right? 10, 15 hands. So that's the one thing that people know about. And young people will come, and I've talked to Stanley Malloy, who until recently was the Dean of the School of Sciences. He has about 10 of those a year where the parents will come in and say, there's no jobs in the ocean. So you don't want to be that. It's like Latin. And I'm here to tell you that this is a fast-growing area, and it is an amazing opportunity. So let me just start with some facts. 71% of the world's surface is water. 90% of all the goods move by water. 98 to 99% of habitable Earth is underwater. Think about that. 98 to 99% of habitable Earth is underwater. That is profound, and the fact that we are on the ocean in a pivot point for the world is unbelievable opportunity for San Diego. Every second breath we take comes from organisms in the ocean. So, let me see here. That's me. So here's our definition of the blue economy. There's a traditional global world ocean economy. There's a traditional water wastewater economy, and look at those numbers, $1.5 trillion. That's 3 times the size of the world's water industry, and yet there's virtually no venture capital that's focused on the ocean economy. Then there's supporting industries, specialty plastics, specialty engineering, because when you deal in the ocean, you're going down to thousands of pounds of PSI. Blow out your tires at a couple hundred pounds. You can't go down low. That's one of the reasons we only dived about 100 feet. And then there's blue tech, which is the innovative portion of this, and that is completely undercounted. In fact, we were chosen as a subject matter expert with NOAA, with somebody that NOAA chose, to put together the first ever satellite account, which are the national statistics, looking at blue tech in the United States. Because there is no way today to know how many jobs there are in blue tech. We've got some things we're working on. I'll tell you about those. So this is another way of looking at that. On the right side, you see a whole bunch of industries, and this is an amazing industry. We look at 16 sectors and 72 subsectors in San Diego, and we have it all. San Diego is an amazing place. 1.5 trillion was the number I quoted before, but look in the lower left, that circle, just to bring your eye there. $500 billion of global water industry. In the space industry, in 2015, $355 billion. We all know about space. We all look up and say, space, that's great, but we don't think about that ocean because it's out there. In fact, many of our young people haven't even been to the ocean. So why should San Diego focus on the blue economy? First, it's an enormous, growing industry. It's counter-cyclical. There's always a place somewhere that needs to understand the water, whether it's Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. 151 countries border on the ocean. Every second breath we take comes from the ocean. That's obviously important. We need to take care of those critters that are creating that for us. If we suddenly went to one of 3, guess what? We're not going to have enough oxygen. And the big 5, when you think about going to 9.5 or 10 billion people, and you think about middle classes rising who want to have better food, better water, travel, the big 5 things will only be solved by the ocean. Food, water, 97% of the world's water is in the ocean. Only 0.8% is accessible on land, and only about half of that replenishes. Ocean energy, inexhaustible, clean, renewable energy. Medicine. We're just beginning to understand the potential for medicine in the ocean, and yet nature has spent hundreds of millions of years developing perfect organisms in water longer than they did on land. And real estate. Doesn't matter why water is rising, but we will have to move every desal plant, every power plant, every port, and yet we continue to build on land because it's what we know. We have to learn to think differently. And this is a characteristic. It looks like being a male or a female. We are on the water. Biotech can go somewhere else. Telecom can go somewhere else. For the blue economy, it needs the ocean. So it's really in our DNA and something that we need to focus on. So we are a nonprofit organization. Our mission statement on the lower right is to promote sustainable, science-based ocean and water industries. Why both? Because there are water clusters, organized concentrations of community of common interest, and there are organized ocean clusters. But we believe our companies sell across that gambit. So we say we are interested in everything wet. I'll talk about the triple helix in a minute, but that brings academia, industry, and policymakers together. And we talk about creating a blue voice, because there hasn't been a blue voice, and it is critical. This is the study that was done in 2012. San Diego was found by ocean. Think about the new San Salvador built by the Maritime Museum 550 plus years ago. We didn't come by wagon train, we didn't come by train. Most people came by ship. We're known because of the Navy and the Marine Corps. They're here because of the ocean. We have Scripps Institution Oceanography, and yet nobody had ever studied the ocean. Blue economy, first study, 2012. And what do we find? 46,000 direct jobs, $14 billion of direct revenue. We didn't have the money, and thank you to San Diego Workforce Partnership, who was our partner in this, and San Diego Regional Economic Development Corporation. But this is amazing because what we found was this is the largest innovation economy in San Diego, and nobody had ever studied it. And these are also good jobs and good wages, because whether you're in your traditional industries, stevedores, crane operators, tugboat operators, they're making a great living. And if you're in blue tech, you're making a great living. And the San Diego economic study that was done a couple years ago showed that there's a barbell effect. We've got great white-collar industries, PhDs, think biotech, think telecom, and we got a lot of lower-wage tourism jobs, but we don't have a lot in the middle. Well, guess what? Blue economy sits in the middle. So hopefully we're going to have the funding to do an updated report in 2018. We now have a baseline from 2012. And as I mentioned earlier, we were asked to be a subject matter expert for the first ever satellite account for blue tech for the United States. This was done by San Diego Regional EDC a couple of years ago in 2016, and so we just took it and reformulated it. So we're in the lower right-hand corner, and I know you can't see that, but everybody's going to have access to these slides, so I left this busy slide there. But we look at these in different ways. So cybersecurity, which we all know about and know it's very important. At the time, in 2016, there were about 3,500 jobs, about $1.5 billion in, quote, total economic impact. But that means direct jobs, indirect jobs, and induced jobs. We haven't even looked at that yet. Now we believe, because of some work that was done by San Diego State for us, that we have one of the highest multipliers is in the blue economy. And it's really exciting to know that we have one of the world's leading, we are the leading US blue tech cluster, we're one of the leading international blue tech clusters. And during the bio, it actually was mentioned that in January of 2017, we helped launch a blue tech cluster alliance with 9 of the leading blue tech clusters from 7 countries in the world. We're very proud to have done that. I'm not going to go through these, there's no test. We are now up to 95 members. I can't put them all on there. This is just to show you how incredibly diverse they are, from very big to very small. We started out in San Diego. We were chosen last year to do a study for the Port of Seattle. They're going to be doing a Marine Innovation Center. We're looking at doing some work for Alta Sea up in Los Angeles. We have been an advisor to Alaska, Hawaii, Washington State, Mississippi, and the Northeast because we are considered a world leader in terms of what we're doing. I wanted to talk about some of our partner organizations. You can see more or less in the middle, right under the word organization, the City of San Diego. We're very thankful, and Chris and I talked a little bit about that. Further down to the lower right, San Diego Workforce Partnership. They sit on our board. We're very thankful to work with them. But it includes the Maritime Museum of San Diego, City of Ensenada, San Diego Regional EDC, and then going further afield, Canada, the Department of Commerce. We are a strategic partner with the U.S. Department of Commerce. Scripps Institution Oceanography, Oceans Advance from Canada, Marine Institute, the National Cluster of Ireland, and it goes on. We've got them from Spain to the Organization of American States. We have many, many partners, and it's incredibly important because the ocean is global. You don't have a win-lose situation in the ocean, because whatever you do in your ocean off our shore, it's going to be in Mexico the day after tomorrow. So this is truly an international global industry. So I talked a little bit about the triple helix, and here it is. We sit right in the middle of that. Academia and education in that yellow box, or yellow circle. We are the organizers of the blue tech industry. And then policy. And policy to us is elected officials, economic development folks, NGOs, press, military, everybody that influences policy. And it's critical, if you're going to create a blue voice and develop your blue economy, to have all of those involved. So blue tech in San Diego today and tomorrow, the present, you need the ocean for the blue economy. That's a great thing to say. And I was on a panel a couple of years ago with a professor from San Diego State, from USD, and he was asked, what are the attributes that this region should play to? And he said there are 3. Number 1 was the ocean, number 2 was the border, and number 3 was the weather. Well, the weather, basically stipulated by the ocean. 2 of those 3 statistics, or those 3 attributes, relate to the ocean, and yet we've never studied the ocean. So we are one of the largest blue tech centers in the world. We have fast-growing companies with 40 to 60% of their sales international. Not many company industries do that. We have good-paying blue and white-collar jobs across wet collars, as we say. We were a virtual incubator for years, and we launched a blue tech incubator in October of 2017 with Scripps Institution Oceanography, the City of San Diego, who was nice enough to fund us, oh my God, on Denton's, the world's largest law firm, and it's actually in their offices. We are recognized for our work nationally and internationally. But the future, there is no list like this today. There's lists of the top ports in the world, and San Diego's not in the top 10 in the world as a port. But when that list is done, we want to be one of the top 5 blue tech centers in the world. We need to create entrepreneurs. We need to create a home educated, I don't mean in the home, I mean here in San Diego home. And then we need more financing for this industry because it's amazing. I'm going to have 2 final slides to talk about what we're doing from an educational point of view and some of the funding that we've been organizing. So for the 3rd year, we run a Blue Tech Week, and we had our largest ever in November, 6th through 10th. We had 493 people from, I think, 17 countries. We had 18 clusters like us, and clusters in formation from 11 countries, but we had obviously people beyond that. And for the 3rd year, we had a Workforce of Tomorrow Day. We took over management for the Sea-Perch program. I'm not going to get into the weeds, but there's a national Sea-Perch program. We were awarded $400,000 to do something to launch the first ever. Now think about this. In the whole world, there is not a Blue Tech jobs website. So my little anecdote about children that talk about being in marine biology, if they knew all the potential jobs that were out there, they could stay and somebody would encourage them to go into the blue economy. We started a partnership with the San Diego Unified School District. And Michael, thank you so much from the board chair is here from San Diego Unified School District. We're thrilled to be working together. We're going to create a Blue STEM Academy and career pathway, and it really is to align industry needs with student experience and create a national model. We are starting several new programs, including a 4-day Blue Economy immersion program with high school students, so to show them the opportunities from blue tech to blue collar. For example, we need about 70,000 new merchant mariners in the next 5 years. We have one of the leading technical schools in the country here in San Diego, and yet they don't have the funding to take at-risk kids in and teach them to be able to earn $60,000 to $100,000 a year. Blue Tech Foundation, I was able to create at San Diego Foundation. We'll be gathering additional funds and pursuing alliances to support a number of blue STEM programs here. And we're looking at educational programs through our clusters internationally. One of the last things we're going to be doing, or one of the things we'll be doing this year, is bringing together all the educational institutions, USD, San Diego State, USD, military, foundations, and others that have focused in some way in a silo on the ocean and or water industry. We're bringing them together to get to know each other, to catalog existing and proposed programs, to catalog existing and explore potential new funding sources, and to promote concrete regional collaboration so we can get some low-hanging fruit. And finally, I always like to end with this slide, this African proverb: if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. And so for all of you in the room, I hope that I'm giving you some taste of the blue economy and blue tech and why it's important for this region. Thanks for letting me have the opportunity. Thanks again for many people here on the dais with us, and I look forward to answering any questions. And if you know anybody with some extra money that would like to support young people in this region, please come and talk to us. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to do another question-answer session. So we are still asking for additional audience written questions, if you have them, and we're happy to use those. For those that can't stay for the panel discussion, we ask that you exit quietly, and don't forget to drop off your evaluation form on the registration desk. Okay, I'll turn it over to Roger.
All right, while we're waiting for some more questions to come up, I wanted to direct this to Chris because Qualcomm is common to both, Qualcomm Company and Qualcomm, the former name of the whatever it is.
Whatever.
Yeah. SDCCU Stadium. And so the question is, in your position as special projects manager for the city, what are you going to do about trying to do what San Diego can to retain Qualcomm in San Diego? And then what are you going to do about the redevelopment of the Qualcomm Stadium property if the San Diego State and Soccer City projects do not get passed by the voters in November?
Okay, well, thank you for an easy one. That's what I like. So on the Qualcomm side, I will tell you our mayor is as the kids say, on it. He is talking with Qualcomm representatives. He is definitely concerned because, again, if Broadcom were to acquire, however they would, the question is, will we keep all the jobs that are currently here today? And of course, that's always a concern. So I do know there are discussions happening. I can't go into those. On the site, we are neutral on the site because we have 2 ballot measures that are currently out there. But I will share with you that should both not pass and they're 50% voter approval, that we are working on a strategy so that we, the citizens, can have certainty in the process. And so the mayor is working on that as we speak.
So this is open to the whole panel, so if any of you want to comment on these things, go ahead. So Eric, you raised your hand.
And so I want to be really careful here because I don't want to misconstrue this. First of all, the mayor working with Broadcom, working with Qualcomm is a great thing. They've been a great company, and they're an important part of the social fabric of San Diego. The other side, or the way to be more, sort of like less terrified, is that we only need to go back about 20, 30 years to 2 other leading San Diego companies, Hybertech and Linkabit. And both of those were large employers in the region and were driving forward in their respective areas. And they also, too, were acquired by out-of-town entities. And what Linkabit did is Linkabit's sort of acquisition and then breakup spawned what I believe now in the Hybertech, the Linkabit family tree is 400 spin-off children and grandchildren in the telecommunications and IT areas, including, a great North County company in Viasat. And then in Hybertech, similarly, that fueled growth in our life science areas. So retaining Qualcomm, critically important, and I wouldn't discount that. But I think that the thing to kind of not lose, maybe too much sleep over is that San Diego's ecosystem of being able to foster the development and the creation of new companies and new startups is pretty good evidence that there could be ways in which that acquisition, while detrimental, would be offset in part by really new startups and new entrepreneurialism.
All right, thank you. The next, we have 2 questions. I'm going to try and combine them. They have a lot to do with our relationship with Tijuana and Baja California. So the person asks, with the cross-border economy and all the labor movement in the San Diego economy, what direction do you see that going in the future? And then a second question was, will San Diego be affected by any changes to NAFTA? Oh, yes, please.
So let me talk about my little world in terms of the blue economy. The leading technical university in Mexico for the ocean economy is Ensenada. It's CICESE, and then we've been partnered with them for a number of years. In addition to the Blue Tech Cluster Alliance that we began in January of 2017, we are creating what we call a cluster building capacity, and so we are helping not just U.S. states trying to launch their own clusters, but also looking in Ensenada, and they have just gotten funding. We hope we're going to update our 2012 study in 2018. They let us know in November that they have also gotten some funding, so we'll actually be doing a bilateral kind of a study that would be tied together. And we're talking with Los Angeles also about doing a similar study. So we'd be looking essentially across what we call the Southern California Bight, which is 17,000 square miles, but it would be Southern California, which is one of the largest concentrations of people in the world. So we are very fortunate to have in Ensenada, not necessarily Tijuana, but clearly all part of Baja California, a very strong ally and that is very interested in the blue economy. And from a NAFTA point of view, I wouldn't say that we have been impacted by that. But we are big believers that we should be working together and certainly would hate to see anything detract from our cross-border
the San Diego region and the Tijuana region, when you look at it, really, they're economically connected. We have about 3.2 million people who live here on this side of the border. There's about 3.2 million people who live south of the border. If you take a aerial view of the the area where people live, we basically have a line that goes right through the middle. So there is a connection there. Our economy is about 10 times the size of the Tijuana economy. And so in terms of huge impacts, I mean, there's a lot more impact on things that happen here in San Diego. There are San Diego companies who've taken advantage of the lower wage rates in Tijuana to build businesses. Taylor Guitars is a great example of a company that was able to enter a completely new market, which was mid-priced guitars, by having them built and assembled in Mexico and then shipping them back across the border. So there are companies who are taking advantage of the maquiladores and cross-border. I think we should be doing more of that. There's a big advantage there to companies who want to build there rather than, for instance, in China or in Vietnam. In terms of NAFTA, the interesting thing there is what is really being tariffed. When we took a look and worked with Taylor a little bit, it's like, is it the component parts that you're being taxed on or tariffed, or is it the actual finished product? And it makes a huge difference. It could be $10 worth of parts, or it's a $10,000 guitar. So a lot of this is still to be determined in terms of what the effect is really going to be if they're imposed.
Okay, a hot topic here that someone brought up is marijuana sales. Do you see the state and local revenue picture improving as a result of the legal cannabis sales in 2018? And I want to add on to that a question about regulation, because as far as I know, San Diego City is the only jurisdiction that has authorized retail sales, and North County, I haven't heard anything from them. So why don't you, who would like to take that up?
You want to take it first, and
Yeah.
I'll take it. Yes, we call it internally the pot tax. And so we actually are going to be engaging a firm, an audit firm that specializes in this area to ensure that San Diego is receiving its fair share. From what I understand, this is a cash business. And I know, well, okay, that
Piles
sounded
of cash.
silly. And so how we do this, what we do, how people bring in the cash, and how businesses are run is something that everyone at the city is very concerned about. I do know that we are looking at, it's too early to tell. I do think from what I've heard is that the difference between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana is that, and medical, and I may get this wrong, but on the medical side, I thought, well, everybody will just get medical because you don't pay tax on it. But in order to get medical, you have to have a doctor's note, so you have to pay for a visit, which then takes some time. You're then on a list, which who knows if that's good or bad, and you have to pay a certification fee. So it could be anywhere from $100 to $150, and then you can get your medical marijuana. So what some of the not concerns, but some of the issues we had was, are people really gonna pay the tax? Well, we're finding that's probably the case, is people are gonna pay the tax. And now I'm hearing primarily is because they're not on a list. So we're on it, we'll know more in probably 6 months.
Eric?
So I think what I'd be fair to say is that North County's public opinion on this issue is divided to negative, and I think that at least in terms of the permitting of recreational sales, I think that fundamentally it's not an economic game changer, and no one should think that it is. It's an industry which is a niche industry that still faces significant uncertainties at the federal level. As Chris pointed out, it's a cash business because of the nature of its relationship to the federal law and then federal banking laws. So it's interesting. It'll generate a lot of headlines. It will generate a lot of passion, I think, on both sides. But it's not going to be employing tens of thousands of people, even in its most optimistic scenarios. And the reason is that I think that I'll put my economist hat on, is that it's scalable. And so if you're in that business, you want to drive your costs down in terms of your cost of production and your costs down in terms of your cost of distribution. And that the easiest way to do that, given that it's an agricultural product, is reduce your labor input. So, I just think, we don't employ millions and millions of people making wheat for bread either in this country. And I think the reason why is sort of straightforward economics.
Okay, we received a few questions about homelessness and various aspects. This question was, this might be a tough one to tackle. How can we get the homeless working and off the streets of San Diego?
I think working comes to me. There is no magic silver bullet, however you might say it, because you can't think of a homeless population in one bucket. There are all kinds of reasons why people are in that situation, and those things need to be attended to, maybe before employment in some cases. In some cases, it is employment that's the root of the problem. And in that situation, of course, I'd say come into our job centers, work with our case managers so we can help get you on the right track and get you employed. But I think it's also important to think about the other causes for homelessness and how we can help people to, whether it be mental illness or anything else, how we can help them to overcome those barriers.
Okay, this is another one for Chris, but some of you others might like to talk about it. It's a sort of a four-part question, but I'll go to the first one. If density in housing and transportation are a high priority for the mayor, what is the mayor of the city doing to become more informed and demonstrate automated shuttle system use? And I'm thinking, I asked Chris that because she was the champion of the FRED system. Maybe you can tell us what that is and what do you think of the future might be for that kind of thing.
Sure. And automated shuttle, we are, San Diego is a demonstration area for automated cars. So we're one of 10 cities in the country that are driverless cars. And so that is coming. But in downtown, what we did, and the mayor supported us strongly, he wanted to see our growth, and we did that because of his urging, is we put together an all-electric shuttle system in downtown that gets to the last mile. That's always the hardest when we have these large transportation systems, but how do you actually get to the front door of where you want to go? So they call that the last mile. So we engaged a firm. Actually, they were out of New York, and they were doing this in the Hamptons, and they had golf carts, but more sophisticated than that. And so we call it FRED, Free Ride Everywhere Downtown. It is, FRED has an app, and you call it up like you would Uber or Lyft, and you say, I want to go from point A to point B, and it's within the parking district, paid for by parking revenues and advertising. And today we have, I'm looking at you, do we know how, 17, would you say, 18 vehicles? Okay, that's okay. We probably have, when I left, the reason is, when I left, we had 17 vehicles and we were going to 20. We have a grant now, all electric, and it works. And so it's free to the end user, subsidized by parking district revenues for the community. We wanted to connect it to Uptown and to Balboa Park, but at the time, Uptown was not as interested in doing that. And so I'm hoping that that decision can be revisited. But that is a way to get at it. And by the way, the reason we did this is because we started studying routes for shuttle circulator systems that would be run by MTS. So they are bus systems, that half mile. And we had 5 routes that would have 10-minute headways, and it would cost us for each route $2 million a year to operate. So that's $10 million a year for that last mile in downtown. These guys come in, it's an on-demand system, and it was MTS, I give them credit for encouraging us to do this. Do an on-demand system that takes you from point A to point B much quicker and easier. And the first 2 years it was subsidized, or the first 3 years, up to $2 million, and that's it. And the entire system is working. We're now going out after a state grant to double the system, but it is working.
All right, our next question has to do with telecommuting. Actually, as my role as a real estate reporter for the Union Tribune, this occasionally comes up as an idea, especially around coastal California. This idea that it is so expensive here, and there's nothing we can really do about it. So maybe, you know, like live in Arizona and telecommute or something like that. So this question from the audience said, do you think employers will be willing to allow employees to work from home?
Who are you asking? Anybody?
Anybody, the whole panel.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings on telecommuting. I think that that employers eventually will allow people to work from home as technology improves and as you can monitor the output of people. Prior to coming to SANDAG, I was the CEO of a software company that was essentially virtual. I had mostly work-at-home employees spread all over the world. They were in New Zealand, Australia, Austria, and all over the United States. And we were able to make it work. And we made it work using teleconferencing and just regularly scheduled meetings. And it was almost like we were all in the same room. So it is possible to do it, but it's a cultural change. And what I've experienced in my work career is that the baby boom generation, maybe even the Gen X generation, in a lot of cases, have a very difficult time wrapping their head around telecommuter, meaning that a person isn't there for a meeting. You have to be in the meeting in order to be productive. But I think as you take a look at the way that the generation that's growing up with smartphones works and operates and how they have their entire social life is on their phone, right? So they don't actually need to go to a party, they just need to text each other in a group text. Okay, when you have this type of thing happening, it's a different mindset. You can get work done without necessarily physically being in the presence of another person. So I think it's taking time to happen, but I think it's going to happen over time. I think as the traffic situation gets worse, and it's not going to get any better here in San Diego or in California, that you're going to see more people open to this, and especially as the younger generation starts to enter into the workforce.
I would also say it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves in the larger conversation of what does flexible work look like, what does work-life balance look like? Because if you're in a scenario where you're telecommuting and there are people in 5 different countries in the call, and I've been in that situation as well, sometimes that means you're on the phone at 9 o'clock at night. So work-life balance doesn't mean you go to work till 5 and then you stop being at work. It means it's a much more interspersed. And at what point does that get exhausting, or what point does that become the new normal?
Yes, we know all about that in the news business. The news never stops. But to Sarah, this is a question I want to expand on it a bit, to discuss the issue brought up at the beginning of the day, which was, or somebody there talked about, out of 20 job categories, there were only 3 that were high income, 17 were 20,000 to 30,000. So this person wants to know, having a lot of trouble getting entry-level blue-collar workers because so many of them fail a drug test or they don't show up. How can we make working a real job seem normal again? So the 2 questions are drug issues and policies, and secondly, this huge number of lower-income workers, and how do you boost their salaries? I mean, we raised the minimum wage this year, but did that make any difference? So kind of, can you address those 3 things somehow, and then the others can chime in as you like.
I'll do my best. So there's a couple of descriptors, at least in that statement, that are tough. Number 1, a real job and normal. So how we define these things is constantly in flux and acceleratingly in flux. So I think from the question, the implication is people don't want to work. If we're a real job, are we talking about 9 to 5 is a real job? How do you address that when that's all changing? Maybe the answer isn't we make somebody work those hours. Maybe it's we change the way we think about work. I can't say much in terms of drug test issues. I'd say we need to rethink our policies if that's something that's keeping you from working, if it's not something that's going to impact in a real meaningful way what's happening on the job. And then minimum wage, I'm really interested to see how it plays out. I mean, you could think about that being a real detriment to the ability of youth to be employed. If the minimum wage is going up, then there's at some point it's more worth it to you to hire somebody with more experience, and you're not going to pay, I don't know, maybe $15 an hour for high school students not enough. I don't know. And I think there's lots of competing theories about how that's going to affect our economy, but it would certainly incentivize the workers to come to work.
Okay, we received several questions about older San Diegans and working. I know some of our panelists, we might have touched on this a bit, but the questions usually involve how do we get older San Diegans involved in the workforce? How do they get jobs? And what is being done to reach out to them?
I think it's Eric's turn.
Yeah. But I'm going to throw it right back to you because on the sort of connecting workers or would-be workers to jobs, I think it's a big challenge, and I think it's I think since we're here, it's a challenge for our higher. One of the challenges. It's one of the challenges for our higher education system. How do we reach working age and older working age adults in a way of allowing them to access upskilling opportunities, educational opportunities, retraining opportunities for institutions that are largely structured and focused and sort of built. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being built that way, but built to serve traditional age students who are in a much different model. Now, we have examples where we're doing that well throughout the county and trying to break that mold. But it's a significantly different mindset in how we would approach that. And again, I'll put my old national university hat on. I think even there, an institution that was really sort of founded and focused on meeting non-traditional students recognizes that it's deeply challenging, and especially deeply challenging in providing educational opportunities for that are focused in on jobs with the highest wage potential and the highest wage growth potential. Not breaking any secrets to say that if you look at adult higher education, adult-centric higher education, a place that they've struggled with is generating degrees in STEM. And there are a whole maybe variety of reasons why that is, but I think that's the looming challenge really actually at the national level. How do we get people in their 40s and maybe even older upskilled for meaningful careers in the sectors that are going to be growing, especially when employers sort of for the last 30 years have sort of been adopted, and there's nothing wrong. I mean, this is the marketplace speaking, a mindset which says, I can rely upon external forces to meet my training needs and my labor force needs. That churn is sufficient, and I'll just ride that wave that goes along. That's going to end because of just demographics. And figuring out that, I'll tell you actually, the entities and firms that figure that out and finally get it right are going to be poised for significant growth and opportunity because there's going to be tremendous demand for people to make those switches based upon where the economy's going.
Yeah, and I would say models, earn and learn models for employment, which is really what you need to think about with the older generation as well, not just the younger generation, because it's really difficult to upskill and go to classes and learn if you have a family, if you need to put food on the table. So if employers take a larger role in this, and they can provide models that pay someone while they're learning, I think it's really going to help to address that issue.
Somebody had a question about blue technologies, but I wanted to expand that to related issues that Robert can start with. How is being environmentally friendly factored into blue tech? We're already taxing our land that affects the ocean. What happens when we start trying to build, live, and work on the ocean? And then I wanted to add to that sort of the educational component, which you mentioned, something about another person asking about how do we incorporate artificial intelligence into our society and how that might affect, and the third thing was climate change. So AI, climate change, blue tech, the world. Robert, can you look at all three of those?
Good luck with that.
Yeah, we're going to be able to.
You mean me?
Yeah.
Michael.
Michael, I mean.
That's
Michael,
all right.
I'm sorry.
I don't know about the AI part, but certainly in terms of working with the ocean, living on the ocean, our mission statement is to promote sustainable, science-based ocean and water industries. And what our indictment, frankly, of the U.S. Both environmentalists and our universities. On the university side, we develop great technology, but we're not very good at tech transfer or creating the industries. And environmentalists have fought things that, from a macro point of view, we can't fight. 91% of all the fish we eat are imported. And yet, environmentalists don't want to have aquaculture here in the United States. Many places around the world haven't been as blessed as we have in terms of having water. So desalination industry really got into high gear in 1964 when the reverse osmosis membrane was patented in San Diego. And this whole idea of, toilet to tap, which, has kind of stopped some of these ideas, is so crazy because the reason it was patented was to allow people to go to the moon using bodily fluids. So from day one, we were going toilet to tap, and yet people fought it. So I think our companies have to be sustainable. Now, when you start putting things on the ocean, there are a whole bunch of issues like what could live underneath it that might die, and we make it very, 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 very difficult to put things out in the water. But guess what? They're doing it in Holland, and I don't remember the number, but 50% of Holland is below the level of the ocean. And so they have had to build expecting inundation constantly, and they've done it in a very sustainable way. And they are a world leader in both helping going around the world, taking the silver lining of, gosh, we pumped a lot of water out because that's what those beautiful windmills were doing for so long, and they basically have a boggy country, and when bog has the water come out of it, it settles and never replenishes the water. So, it was really pretty, but now you don't have any windmills kind of working anymore because that would exacerbate the problem. So I tell you that because from a science point of view, there are things that we have to do, just like demographically. We can tell that we have to have food, we have to have water from the ocean, and our technologies are often being developed in U.S. universities, and they're going to a place like Norway or China, and they're being picked up. And we are not taking advantage of those. And it's partially because environmentalists have said, don't touch my ocean, and it'll resuscitate, but we're importing the problems from somewhere else. And so our belief is that we have to go forward and say, we're going to deal with the ocean, we're going to be a world leader in creating solutions that can be the best compromise, because everything we do, every time you plow a field, you're killing worms, but yet we want to eat something. And so everything we do, whether it's in the ocean or it's on land, is a compromise. And I think San Diego has an amazing opportunity to work with enormous opportunities with people like Scripps Institution Oceanography and San Diego State. USD has a wonderful kind of science program with big ocean related. The other question about AI, I'm not sure how to deal with, but living on the ocean, we absolutely have to do it. It's being done in other places. We're going to have to build. I'll make one more last comment. We've been working with Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories for a number of years, and they believe, for a number of reasons, that we will have to build offshore ports. We continue to import stuff and export stuff as part of the world and just-in-time economy, and yet there's no more places to build ports on the West Coast or the East Coast. No more places. So how are we going to do that? Because we've built all the way around the Port of San Diego, Port of Oakland. There is no way to expand unless you go out into the water. So do you want to buy that stuff that we buy? 90% of all the work goods are moving by ocean. So we have to build into the ocean. There's no question. And so the question is, what point does the light bulb go on? When does the politicians say this is something we have to go to bat for? And and that's why we try and bring a blue voice together that brings academia, industry, and the policymakers together and talk about these big issues, big policy, so that we can begin to really address these in meaningful ways. So the third one I can't remember. AI, living on the ocean.
Climate change.
Climate change. Well, I look at climate change. We're not going to stop climate change. I mean, we look across hundreds of thousands of years, and water goes up, it comes back down again. There's no way that we're going to stop the rising of the ocean, but we're not preparing for it. And that's the problem. And places like Holland have prepared for it, and they are, in fact, selling that expertise around the world. And I'd like to see San Diego, which has the opportunity to be a world leader in thinking about how to deal with the ocean. I was going to say to Chris afterwards, if you go to our beautiful convention center, and we are built on the ocean, do you think you can get to the ocean from our convention center? No. We ignored, the back is to the ocean. So we didn't incorporate the ocean in that convention center. So the next piece, I hope, will in fact incorporate that. So the ocean is something that we have to live with, and climate change is definitely a huge issue, but the silver lining is if we do it right, we can actually create a lot of export opportunities.
Of course, if we have ocean rising, the water will be at the convention center in 50 years anyways.
I just want to mention on the convention center expansion, there is a ballot measure. I'm not speaking for the city at all, but I will tell you that phase 3 is beautiful and accesses the water. And so I think that is a fantastic proposal that they put forward.
All right, that's all the time we have for questions. Roger, do you have any summary of this event?
Well, I was circling a few of the highlights I picked out today, and some of you might agree with me. We learned that our population is going to go up by 650,000 by 2050, and by then we'll have 500,000 plus 75-plus-year-old people that have to be taken care of, and some will want to keep working, so how are we going to deal with that? We learned that of the occupations, the 20 top occupations, 17 pay $20,000 to $30,000 a year, so we need to find a way to boost those incomes. We learned that the economy might slow by 2020 and be looking forward to that inverted curve of low and long-term interest rates, because that might be the signal that things might be slowing down, if not reversing. We learned about companies ought to be the center of developing talent pools for our workers, and that 43,000 people from 16 to 24 are not in school and not working, and we need to draw them into the economy and make them productive part of society. We learned about housing, and the solution might include raising density, reducing costs, and creating a community village feeling so people like to live in higher density neighborhoods. San Diego is efficient in health care, but can we be even more efficient when we have that many more people that will need it in the next couple of generations? And finally, we learned about the blue tech economy. It's related to food, water, energy, and medicine, and real estate. All those 5 items touch the waters, and San Diego is a natural place for the blue tech world to be centered. So I want to thank our panelists so much for joining us today.
All right, excellent. Okay, all right, thank you, Roger. All right.